Welcome back to Manifest Masters. Tonight, we're going somewhere. Not far, not really. Just back. Back through centuries of dust and marble and candlelight, to a city that once held 1,000,000 souls within its walls. A city of whispered gossip and grand ambition. Of senators and street vendors. Of gods carved in stone and bread baked before dawn. Tonight, we walk through ancient Rome. Not as a historian. Not with dates and battles and the weight of textbooks. But softly, slowly, the way you might drift through a dream. So settle in. Let your body go heavy. And let Rome come to you. Imagine the city at night. The streets are narrow, far narrower than you might picture. Rome's roads were rarely wider than a hallway between two close buildings, stone pressing in on either side, the sky above just a thin ribbon of stars. And the city knew it had a problem, because into those narrow streets, every merchant, every farmer, every trader with a cart full of grain or timber or amphory of wine needed to pass. The congestion during daylight hours was, by all ancient accounts, completely overwhelming. So Julius Caesar did something about it. He passed a law, one of the more quietly remarkable laws in Roman history, banning all wheeled vehicles from the city streets during the daytime. From sunrise until around the 10th hour, roughly 4 in the afternoon, no carts, no wagons, no delivery vehicles of any kind. The streets of Rome during the day belonged entirely to people on foot. It was a genuine attempt at urban planning, thousands of years before the concept had a name. And in its own strange way, it worked. The days were calmer. The streets moved. People could breathe. But the nights were a different story entirely, because all of those banned vehicles had to come sometime. And so they came after dark. The moment the sun dipped below the hills surrounding the city, the carts rolled in. Wooden wheels on stone cobbles, a sound that anyone who has ever dragged luggage across cobblestones will immediately understand, echoing through the narrow streets for hours on end. The shouting of drivers, the braying of donkeys, the crack of wood, the crash of something dropped. Roman citizens who lived in the city, particularly those in upper-floor apartments, complained endlessly about the noise. The poet Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century, described the sleeplessness of Rome with real bitterness, the relentless clatter outside the window, night after night, making rest feel like an impossible luxury. In a city of 1,000,000 people, the price of daytime peace was a night that never truly went quiet. And yet despite all of that noise, despite the chaos that rolled through the streets after dark, there was something else happening in Rome at night too. Something quieter. Something that has always happened in cities, in every age. People finding corners of stillness within the noise. Taverns with low light and warm wine. Courtyards open to the stars. The sound of a fountain somewhere nearby, steady and unchanging, cutting through everything else like a thread of calm. As the night deepened and the carts finally slowed, the city would drift, eventually, into something like sleep. And then the mornings would come fast. By the 2nd or 3rd hour after sunrise, what we might call 7 or 8 in the morning, Rome was already fully alive. And one of the first things its citizens needed was breakfast. But here is where something surprising comes in. Because most Romans, and we mean the vast majority of the city's population, could not simply walk into a kitchen and cook something. They didn't have one. Most of Rome's population lived in large apartment buildings called insulae. These were multi-story residential blocks, some of them rising 6, even 7 stories high, making them among the tallest residential buildings anywhere in the ancient world at that time. They were crowded, often poorly built, and frequently in danger of collapse or fire. And because open flames in the upper floors of a tightly packed wooden building were considered far too dangerous, most insulae had no kitchens at all. No hearth, no stove, no place to prepare a warm meal. So the people of Rome ate out. Almost every single meal, every single day. And the city had built an entire infrastructure to feed them. On almost every street corner, set into the ground floors of buildings, were small food counters called thermopolia. These were essentially the fast food restaurants of the ancient world, and they were everywhere. In Pompeii alone, which was a mid-sized Roman city of perhaps 20,000 people, archaeologists have uncovered more than 80 of them. 80 separate food counters in a single city. Scaled up to Rome itself, with its 1 million inhabitants, the number would have been staggering. A thermopolium had a distinctive look. A stone counter, smooth and worn from years of use, with large circular holes cut into its surface. Sitting down into those holes were ceramic jars, called dolia, and inside those jars, kept warm by the stone around them, was food. Stews and lentils, olives and cheese, wine mixed with water or honey, hunks of flatbread. You would walk up, point at what you wanted, pay a small coin, and eat standing right there at the counter, or sitting on a step nearby, watching the street go by. And we know this not just from historical records, but from the food itself. When archaeologists excavated a remarkably well-preserved thermopolium in Pompeii in 2020, they found traces of actual food still detectable inside the dolia after 2,000 years. Duck, pork, fish, snails, a wine and herb broth whose chemical signature was still present in the ceramic. 2,000 years, and the ghost of that morning meal was still there, waiting to be found. Picture that for a moment. The hands that last touched that jar. The person who ladled that stew, who passed a cup of warm wine across that stone counter, who wiped the surface clean at the end of a long day and walked home through the noisy streets. Gone for 20 centuries. And yet something of their morning remains. Rome was a city that left traces like that everywhere. In its stones, in its pipes, in its laws, in its recipes. A city so enormous and so alive that even its smallest moments had weight. After breakfast, after the streets filled and the business of the day began, the city would eventually make its way, as it always did, as it did every day without fail, to the baths. The Roman bathhouse was not simply a place to get clean. That is perhaps the most common misunderstanding about it. The thermae, the great public baths of Rome, were something far more complex and far more human than that. They were social institutions, gathering places, something between a gymnasium, a spa, a library, a meeting hall, and a neighborhood cafe, all folded into one vast and beautiful building. Marble floors, painted ceilings, the sound of water echoing off stone walls, the warmth of steam rolling through vaulted rooms. The largest of Rome's bathhouses, the Baths of Caracalla, built in the early 3rd century, was almost incomprehensibly large. It covered an area larger than many modern sports stadiums. It had hot rooms and cold rooms and warm rooms, each one carefully engineered with an underfloor heating system called a hypocaust, where hot air circulated beneath raised floors and through hollow walls. It had gardens and libraries and open exercise yards. And on a busy day, it could hold up to 8,000 visitors at once. 8,000 people, all moving through this one building. Talking, exercising, resting, arguing, conducting business, simply existing together in the particular intimacy that shared warm water creates between strangers. And all of them, as they moved through those warm rooms, were cleaning themselves in a way that would seem very strange to us today. Because Romans did not use soap. Not in the way we understand it. Instead, they had a ritual, elegant in its own way, that began with oil. Olive oil, applied to the skin before exercise. You would coat yourself, move your body, sweat, and then when you were done, an attendant, or, if you were wealthy, one of your enslaved household, would take a curved metal tool called a strigil and draw it slowly across your skin, scraping away the mixture of oil and sweat and the day's dirt in long, deliberate strokes. The strigil was a personal object, cherished, sometimes ornate. Wealthy Romans had them made of bone or silver. They carried them to the baths the way we might carry a towel. And it worked. Researchers who have studied the practice confirm that the combination of oil and mechanical removal is genuinely effective at cleaning skin, perhaps even gentler than harsh soap. It was slow, deliberate, almost meditative, the kind of cleaning that required patience, that required someone to pay attention to your body, to care for it with time and intention. In a city that moved as fast and as loudly as Rome, the bathhouse was where you were finally, deliberately, slow. Let the warmth of that settle over you. The steam, the marble, the sound of water, the slow drag of the strigil, the particular silence of a body finally at rest. Rome understood something that we sometimes forget. That rest is not simply the absence of work. That leisure, real leisure, built into the structure of a life, is part of what makes a civilization hold together. And the Romans built that understanding directly into their calendar. At various points in the Roman Empire's history, the official calendar held as many as 180 public festival days per year. Nearly half the entire year. These were not optional. They were official, sanctioned by the state, observed across the city, and funded, at least in part, by public money and by the emperors themselves. Markets would close. Courts would not sit. Certain kinds of work were suspended entirely. 180 days. Think about what that means in a life. That nearly every other day, Rome stopped, breathed, celebrated something, a god, a season, a military victory, a founding myth. The rhythm of the Roman year was not the relentless forward march we tend to imagine from an empire. It was punctuated constantly by pause. And the grandest of those pauses, the ones that drew the entire city together in a single shared experience, were the games. The gladiatorial games. The chariot races. The theatrical performances and animal hunts staged in great stone arenas. These were not simply entertainment. They were, in the most literal sense, political tools. Emperors understood, and said so openly, that the loyalty of a population depended on two things above all else: food and spectacle. The Romans had a phrase for it that has survived 2,000 years and is still quoted today: panem et circenses, bread and circuses, and so the games were free, almost always, entirely free to attend. The emperor paid. The tickets, small pieces of pottery or bone that served as seat assignments, were distributed to the population. Everyone could come. The poorest citizen of Rome and the wealthiest senator might sit in the same great stone bowl, separated only by a few tiers of seating, both of them watching the same spectacle unfold in the sand below. It was an act of political theater as much as entertainment. A reminder, staged in stone and blood and roaring crowd noise, of who was providing all of this. Who was keeping Rome alive and fed and distracted and amazed. The greatest arena for all of this, the building that more than any other has come to represent Rome in the imagination of the modern world, was the Colosseum. And it was, by any measure, an extraordinary feat of engineering. It could seat somewhere between 50 and 80,000 spectators. Its outer walls rose to nearly 50 meters. It was built in less than a decade, a fact that still astonishes historians, given that it required an estimated 100,000 cubic meters of travertine stone, transported from quarries miles away. And it was designed, with a sophistication that modern stadium architects openly admire, to move enormous crowds with remarkable efficiency. The Colosseum had 80 separate entrance arches. Its internal corridors were calculated to distribute the crowd evenly, and its exit passageways, called vomitoria, a word that has nothing to do with its modern connotation and simply meant a passage that poured people out, were so well engineered that the entire crowd of 50,000 people could be fully evacuated in under 15 minutes. That figure is still used as a benchmark in modern stadium design. 2,000 years later, and the Romans are still teaching us how to build. But the Colosseum kept its greatest secret hidden. Beneath the wooden arena floor, the floor that was covered in sand, that sand stained dark by the day's events, there was an entire world that the audience above could never see. A vast underground complex of corridors and chambers and shafts, called the hypogeum. It stretched across the full footprint of the arena above it, a kind of subterranean city humming with purpose on the days of the games. Down there, in the dim torchlight, animals paced in their cages: lions, bears, leopards, ostriches, rhinoceroses brought from the far edges of the empire at enormous cost and effort. Gladiators waited in holding rooms, listening to the muffled roar of the crowd above them. And at various points throughout the arena, wooden platforms attached to a system of ramps and counterweights and human-powered winches could be raised directly upward, through trapdoors in the floor above, delivering animals or fighters or entire elaborate stage sets directly into the arena, as if conjured from the earth itself. The crowd above had no idea how any of it worked. They simply saw a trapdoor open, and something magnificent, or terrifying, emerge from below. The hypogeum was the machinery behind the magic. Rome's greatest trick, hidden in plain sight beneath everyone's feet. And as the games played out above, and the crowd roared, and the city moved through its long and layered day, Rome kept going. Always building. Always reaching. Aqueducts stretching for miles across open valleys on their long stone legs. Roads cutting straight and deliberate through forests and mountains. Concrete mixed with volcanic ash and poured into the sea itself to build harbor walls that are still standing today, still holding against the tide, 2,000 years after the hands that built them turned to dust. But those stories belong to a little further into the night. For now, Let the city breathe around you. Let the torches gutter softly in the dark streets. Let the sound of the fountain find you, steady and slow, somewhere across the stone. Let Rome hold you, just for a while. Rome never truly slept. Even in the quietest hours, when the cart wheels had finally stilled and the last tavern had dimmed its lamps, the city breathed. You could feel it, that particular aliveness that only very large cities have, the sense that somewhere nearby, always, something is happening. A baby crying in an upper apartment. A dog moving through an alley. The distant sound of the river, the Tiber, sliding dark and steady through the city's heart the way it always had, the way it always would. The Tiber was everything to Rome. It was the reason Rome existed at all. A navigable river close enough to the sea to allow trade, sitting at the center of a peninsula that jutted into the Mediterranean like an outstretched arm. Rome had grown up around that river, built toward it and away from it in all directions, spread itself across 7 hills and then kept going, spilling into valleys and up slopes and along the roads that radiated outward from the city like the spokes of an enormous wheel. And at the center of all of it, always, was water. Romans were obsessed with water, devoted to it in a way that was almost spiritual. And they had moved mountains, or at least carved through them, to bring it into their city. The aqueduct system of ancient Rome was one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world, and it is difficult to overstate just how extraordinary it was. At the height of the empire, 11 major aqueducts fed the city of Rome. Together, they carried somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million cubic meters of fresh water into the city every single day. That is roughly equivalent to the daily water consumption of a modern city of several million people. Delivered not by pumps, not by electricity, not by any technology beyond gravity and the patient genius of engineers who understood how to follow a slope, but simply by water finding its own level, flowing down through stone channels from the hills and mountains surrounding Rome, across valleys on those famous arched bridges, and into the city below. The water fed the baths. It fed the fountains, hundreds of them scattered throughout the city, always running, always available, so that even the poorest resident of the highest and most crowded insulae was never more than a short walk from clean, fresh, cold water. It fed private homes. It fed the imperial palaces. It fed the public latrines, which were flushed continuously by a stream of running water that never stopped. Rome's water never stopped. The aqueducts ran day and night, every day of the year. If you pressed your hand against the stone channel of one, you could feel the faint vibration of all that moving water, a pulse running through the rock like the city's own heartbeat. And the Romans wasted almost none of it. The water that overflowed from the fountains, and it always overflowed, intentionally, because the system was designed to flow continuously rather than fill and stop, drained down into the streets in small channels, flushing them clean as it went, before disappearing into the great sewer that ran beneath the city. The Cloaca Maxima, one of the oldest structures in all of Rome, and still, in some sections, in use today. The Cloaca Maxima, the Great Drain, was ancient even by Roman standards. It had been begun, according to tradition, during the era of the kings, centuries before the Republic, centuries before Caesar, centuries before the emperors. It started as an open drainage channel cutting through the low-lying valley that would eventually become the Roman Forum, carrying water away from the marshy ground and into the Tiber. Over time it was covered, expanded, engineered into something extraordinary, a vaulted stone tunnel wide enough in some sections for a boat to pass through, running beneath the streets of Rome and carrying away the waste of 1 million people. It was, in its own unglamorous way, as impressive as any temple or aqueduct. Because without it, Rome could not have existed at scale. Cities of that size had always been felled by disease before Rome, had always reached some population threshold, and then collapsed under the weight of their own waste. Rome survived in part because it built a sewer good enough to hold 1 million people, and the outlet of that sewer, where the Cloaca Maxima emptied into the Tiber, was marked, as only Rome would, with an arched stone mouth carved with a face. A drain made beautiful. Functional infrastructure given dignity. Above the sewer, above the water channels, above the cobblestones worn smooth by 1 million feet, the Forum rose. The Roman Forum was the center of everything. Not just geographically, though it was that too, sitting in the valley between the Palatine and Capitoline hills, ringed by temples and government buildings and the rostra from which great speeches had been delivered and great lies told with equal confidence. It was the center in the deeper sense, the place where Roman life converged, where law was made and broken, where commerce happened and gossip spread and elections were won and lost, where the bodies of emperors were burned on great pyres and their ashes collected into urns. To stand in the Forum during the height of the empire would have been an overwhelming experience. The buildings were not the pale stone ruins we see today, they were vivid, painted in rich colors, adorned with gilded bronze statues that caught and scattered the sunlight, draped in banners and garlands on festival days. The temples had red and gold and blue on their pediments. The columns were not bare marble but decorated surfaces. Ancient Rome was not white. The Romans painted everything, colored everything, gilded everything they could. The austere monochrome world we associate with classical antiquity is largely an accident of time. The paint wore away, the bronze was melted down, and what remained was stone. But in its living moment, Rome was one of the most colorful cities that has ever existed. At the edge of the Forum, on a raised platform called the Rostra, politicians and lawyers and emperors had long addressed the crowds that gathered below. And if you wanted to be heard in Rome, truly heard, by the thousands of people who might pass through the Forum in a single day, you had to know how to speak. Oratory was not merely a skill in Rome. It was an art form, a martial discipline, a path to power as direct and reliable as any military career. The greatest orator Rome ever produced was not an emperor or a general, but a lawyer. Marcus Tullius Cicero, born in a small town outside Rome, from a family without political connections, without inherited wealth or military glory, rose to become the most powerful voice in the Roman Republic through nothing but the force of his words. He studied rhetoric with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He traveled to Greece to learn from the greatest teachers of the age. He trained his voice, his breath, his body, his memory, in the understanding that in the Forum, the man who could speak best was often the man who won. Cicero's speeches still exist. You can read them today in translation, and they are still, after 2,000 years, remarkable. Structured with a precision that feels almost architectural. Built to persuade, to move, to destroy an opponent or elevate a client. When Cicero stood on the rostra and spoke, crowds fell quiet. Senators shifted in their seats. And once, most famously, he stood up in the Senate and delivered a speech that drove a would-be dictator named Catiline out of Rome through sheer rhetorical force alone, saving the Republic, at least for a while. But Rome was not only shaped by its great men, or only by its free ones. Beneath the glittering surface of the empire, beneath the painted temples and the free games and the endless fresh water, was a foundation built, in significant part, on the labor of enslaved people. Slavery in Rome was vast in scale. Estimates vary, but at the height of the empire, enslaved people may have made up somewhere between 20 and 30% of the total population of the city of Rome. In the wider empire, the numbers were similarly staggering. They worked in mines, in fields, in households, in bakeries, in workshops. They served as tutors and physicians and skilled craftspeople. They built the aqueducts and the roads and the great public buildings. The entire infrastructure of Roman civilization rested, in ways that Romans themselves acknowledged and largely took for granted, on this foundation. And yet Roman slavery, while brutal in many of its forms, had one feature that distinguished it from many later systems of enslavement in human history. It was not racial. Enslaved people in Rome came from every part of the known world: Gauls, Greeks, Egyptians, Syrians, Britons, Africans, and their status was legal rather than inherited in perpetuity. Manumission, the formal freeing of an enslaved person, was relatively common in Rome. An enslaved person who was freed by a Roman citizen became, in most cases, a Roman citizen themselves. Their children, born after manumission, were free Romans with full legal rights. Some freed people rose to positions of significant wealth and influence. The system was still brutal, still fundamentally unjust, still a machinery of human suffering at enormous scale. But it was a different shape of injustice than what would come later in history, and understanding that difference matters. By now the night has deepened around the city. The Forum is quiet. The rostra stands empty in the dark, the space where 1,000 speeches have poured out into the air now holding only silence. Above the city, the sky is enormous. No electric light to dim it, no haze of modern industry, just the stars as the Romans saw them every night. Clear and countless and close enough, almost, to touch. The Romans watched those stars carefully. They named them, mapped them, built their calendar around them. And that calendar, adjusted, reformed, corrected over centuries, became, in its essential structure, the calendar that most of the world still uses today. The months, you know. The year of 365 days. The leap year, added every fourth year to keep the calendar aligned with the actual rotation of the Earth around the Sun. All of it traces back, in a direct and unbroken line, to Julius Caesar's calendar reform of 46 BC, the Julian calendar, and the later Gregorian refinement of it in 1582. Caesar's reform was itself a dramatic event. By the time he got around to fixing it, the Roman calendar had drifted so far out of alignment with the actual solar year that the seasons no longer matched the months at all. To correct this, Caesar inserted extra months into that single year, 46 BC, stretching it to 445 days in total, the longest year in recorded history. Romans called it the Year of Confusion. And then, from the following year onward, the new calendar began. Clean, aligned, recognizable, the one we still wake up to every morning. Let that thought carry you gently forward into the quiet dark of the Roman night. 445 days. A year that lasted longer than any year before or since. A year in which everyone, the senators, the soldiers, the vendors at the Thermopolia, the attendants in the bathhouses, the engineers bending over their aqueduct channels, all of them had to simply keep going. Keep moving through a year that refused to end. Until finally, at last, it did. And the new calendar began, and Rome moved forward into the shape of time we still inhabit today. The city breathes around you. The stars wheel slowly overhead. And somewhere in the warm dark, Rome keeps dreaming. The stars above Rome were the same stars that hung above the farms and the forests and the long straight roads that stretched out from the city in every direction. And along those roads, in the deep quiet of the night, something was always moving. Rome's roads were among the most remarkable things the empire ever built. Not the most beautiful, not the most celebrated. The temples and the arches and the great public baths claimed that distinction easily. But the roads were perhaps the most consequential. At the height of the empire, the Roman road network stretched for more than 400,000 kilometers. 400,000. Enough to circle the earth 10 times over. Cutting through forests and mountains and marshes, crossing rivers on stone bridges, climbing passes that would have been considered impassable by any army that came before. And they were built to last. Not packed earth, not gravel loosely laid, but engineered structures with multiple layers of foundation, topped with fitted stone and slightly curved so that rainwater drained to the sides and never pooled on the surface. Some of those roads are still visible today. Some are still walked. And beneath several modern European highways, if you dug deep enough, you would find Roman stone. The roads served one primary purpose above all others, and it was not commerce, though commerce flowed along them constantly. It was military. Rome's roads were built by soldiers, for soldiers, and the ability to move a legion from one end of the empire to the other with speed and reliability was what kept the whole vast structure from falling apart. A Roman legion, roughly 5,000 men, could march between 25 and 30 kilometers on a good road in a single day. They carried their own equipment, built their own camps at the end of each day's march, and dismantled them again in the morning. The camps followed a standard design so familiar to every soldier that they could be constructed in the dark, by exhausted men, in hostile territory, in under an hour. Order imposed on chaos. Routine as a form of survival. And when those legions arrived somewhere, when Rome extended its reach into a new territory, a new province, a new corner of the known world, the first thing they built was not a palace or a temple. It was a road. Because a road meant control. A road meant that reinforcements could arrive. That grain could be transported. That the governor's orders could travel outward and taxes could travel back. The road was the nervous system of the empire, and without it, the empire was simply too large to hold. But the roads also carried something else. Something quieter and more surprising than armies. They carried mail. Rome had a postal system, the cursus publicus, that was, for its time, extraordinarily sophisticated. It was not a public service in the modern sense. Ordinary citizens could not simply drop a letter into a box and have it delivered across the empire. The cursus publicus existed primarily to carry official government communications, letters from the emperor, dispatches from governors, military intelligence, legal documents. But it functioned with a reliability and speed that would not be matched in the Western world for more than 1,000 years after Rome's fall. Relay stations were positioned along the major roads at intervals of roughly 15 kilometers, close enough that a horse could cover the distance at a canter without tiring. At each station, fresh horses waited. A rider would arrive, hand off his dispatch pouch to a fresh rider on a fresh horse, and the message would continue without pause. An urgent imperial message could travel at speeds of up to 300 kilometers per day. A letter sent from Rome could reach the eastern provinces within a week. The edges of Britain within days. In a world with no telecommunications, no telegraph, no radio, the cursus publicus was as close to instant communication as any civilization would achieve for the next 15 centuries. Think about what it meant to govern an empire that size. To sit in Rome and make decisions whose consequences would play out thousands of kilometers away, months after the order was given. To receive a report from a general on the eastern frontier and know that by the time the reply arrived, everything described in that report had already changed. Roman emperors and senators were making decisions in a constant state of temporal displacement, always responding to the world as it had been rather than the world as it was. And yet, for centuries, they held it together, kept the edges from fraying, maintained enough coherence across that enormous, diverse, noisy, contradictory empire that the people living within it, in Britain, in Egypt, in Spain, in Syria, all understood themselves, in some meaningful sense, to be Roman. Part of what held it together was law. Roman law is perhaps the most enduring legacy of the empire, more enduring even than the roads, more enduring than the aqueducts or the buildings or the language. The legal systems of most of the modern Western world, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, much of Latin America, Scotland, Louisiana, are built directly on the foundation of Roman law. Its principles, its terminology, its fundamental assumptions about the relationship between the individual and the state, between contract and obligation, between crime and punishment, all of it flows forward from Rome in an unbroken current. The Romans were not the first people to write down laws, but they were among the first to treat law as a science, to argue about it, refine it, publish commentaries on it, teach it systematically, and apply it, at least in theory, consistently across an empire of millions of people. Roman jurists were some of the most celebrated intellectuals of their age. Their writings were collected, preserved, and eventually compiled into what became known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, assembled under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century AD. That compilation became the legal Bible of medieval Europe, and its influence has never fully faded. At the heart of Roman law was a concept that still sits at the heart of most modern legal systems. The idea that a person is innocent until proven guilty, that the burden of proof falls on the accuser, not the accused, that evidence must be presented, argued, and evaluated before a judgment is rendered. These ideas feel so natural to us now that it is easy to forget they had to be invented, that there was a time when accusation alone was often sufficient for punishment. Rome did not always live up to its own legal ideals. Emperors ignored inconvenient laws with ease, and justice was distributed very unequally across social classes. But the ideals themselves were written down, argued over, and preserved, and that preservation mattered enormously. The night is deep now over Rome. The law courts are empty. The forum is quiet. The roads beyond the city gates stretch away into darkness, the relay stations dimly lit, horses breathing softly in their stalls, waiting for the next rider to arrive with the next pouch of dispatches from somewhere far away. In the wealthier parts of the city, on the slopes of the Palatine Hill, where the oldest and most prestigious addresses in Rome were found, the houses of the powerful sat behind high walls, turned inward away from the street, built around central courtyards open to the sky. The Roman domus, the private townhouse of a wealthy family, was designed around the idea of interiority, of a world held within walls, protected from the noise and the chaos of the street outside. You entered through a narrow doorway, often deliberately narrow, to control who came in, and passed through a short corridor into the atrium, a large central room with a rectangular opening in the roof and a shallow pool on the floor below it to collect rainwater. Light fell through that opening in a column, shifting with the time of day and the season, marking time inside the house the way a sundial marked it outside. Beyond the atrium lay further rooms, the tablinum, where the head of the household would receive clients and conduct business, the triclinium where the family dined, the cubicula where they slept. And at the back, often, a garden. A real garden, planted with herbs and fruit trees and flowers, open to the sky, surrounded by a colonnade. In the middle of a city of 1 million people, behind an unassuming street door, a garden in full bloom, birdsong in the morning, the smell of rosemary and fig. And in those gardens, in those cool colonnaded spaces, Roman families gathered for the meal that mattered most to them. Not breakfast. Breakfast was barely a meal, just bread and olive oil eaten quickly, standing up, often while walking. Not lunch. Lunch was similarly casual, taken in the middle of the day wherever you happened to be, whatever was available at the nearest thermopolium or from a basket carried from home. No, the meal that mattered in Rome was dinner. The cena. The evening meal, taken late, often lasting for hours, conducted while reclining on cushioned couches arranged around a low central table in groups of 3. The Romans ate lying down. Or rather, the Romans who could afford to eat lying down, reclining on their left sides, propped on one elbow, reaching forward with the right hand to take food from the table. It was considered the civilized way to dine. Standing or sitting upright at dinner was for lower social classes, for children, for those who had not yet earned the right to recline. Reclining was leisure made visible. It was the posture of a person who had the time, the space, and the social position to be comfortable. And a Roman dinner could last a very long time indeed. Multiple courses, wine mixed with water and passed around repeatedly, conversation and music, and occasionally performances between courses. Hours spent horizontal around a table. The evening dissolving slowly into night. And what did they eat in those long, lamplit evenings? The food of Rome was more sophisticated and more strange than most people expect. Garum was everywhere, a fermented fish sauce, made by layering fish and salt in large vessels and leaving them to liquefy slowly in the sun over months. The resulting liquid, amber-colored and intensely savory, was used the way we might use salt or soy sauce today. Added to almost everything, used as a condiment, traded across the empire in distinctive amphorae whose distribution archaeologists can trace across thousands of kilometers. Garum was Rome's flavor. Its umami. Its most essential ingredient. And the factories that produced it, large, smelly, noisy operations, were considered such a nuisance that they were banned from being built within city limits. The lamplight flickers over the dinner table. The smell of garum mingles with roasted meat and fresh bread and the sweetness of honeyed wine. Voices rise and fall in conversation. Someone laughs. A child is carried off to bed by a household slave, still drowsy and protesting softly against a shoulder. And Rome moves deeper into the night. The garden holds the last of the evening's warmth. The stars, through the open roof of the atrium, are very bright. Somewhere on the Palatine Hill, in the palace that rises above all other buildings in the city, a lamp is still burning. But we will leave that light for a little later. For now, let the garden hold you. Let the colonnade stand quiet around you. Let the fountain in the corner of the courtyard speak in its soft, continuous voice. Rest here for just a little while. There is a hill in Rome that remembers everything. The Palatine, the oldest of Rome's 7 hills, the one where, according to tradition, Romulus himself drew the first boundary of the city in the dirt with a plow, had been the most desirable address in Rome for as long as anyone could remember. Wealthy families had built their homes there for centuries, drawn by the elevation, the views, the distance from the noise and smell of the streets below. And then the emperors came, and the wealthy families were gradually, politely, and then not so politely displaced, and the hill became something else entirely. It became the palace. Not one palace, but many, built over and into and on top of each other across the centuries, each new emperor adding to or rebuilding what came before, until the Palatine Hill was essentially one enormous architectural accumulation. A layered thing like geological strata, each layer a different reign, a different vision of what power should look like when it is made into stone. The very word palace comes from this hill. Palatine became Palatium, and Palatium became the word for the residence of a ruler in Latin, and then in French, and then in English. Every palace that has ever existed, Versailles, Buckingham, the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, carries in its name the ghost of that hill in Rome. The emperors who lived on that hill were among the most powerful human beings who have ever existed. At the height of the Roman Empire, the emperor controlled territory stretching from the north of Britain to the borders of Mesopotamia, from the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north to the Sahara Desert in the south. Tens of millions of people, some estimates suggest as many as 70 million, lived within the borders of the empire and were subject, ultimately, to the will of one man. One person, sitting on that hill above Rome, whose word could end a war or start one, whose signature on a document could determine the fate of a province, whose mood on a given morning could ripple outward in ways that would be felt thousands of kilometers away, months later, by people who had never seen his face. And yet the emperors themselves were not always the towering figures of authority that the word emperor conjures. Some of them were brilliant administrators, careful and methodical, governing with a patience and intelligence that held the empire together through enormous pressures. Some were catastrophically bad, vain, erratic, cruel, detached from the reality of the world they nominally ruled. And some were simply ordinary men placed by accident of birth or politics into a position of extraordinary power, doing their uncertain best in a role that had no real precedent and offered no instruction manual. One of the most remarkable things about the Roman emperorship was how it was not, technically, inherited. Not at first and not always. Rome called itself a republic long after it had effectively become a monarchy, and the title of emperor, imperator, was in theory a military honor, not a hereditary title. The Senate retained the formal power to appoint and approve emperors, even when that power was largely theatrical. And in practice, succession was genuinely uncertain and genuinely dangerous. Of the first 15 emperors of Rome, from Augustus, who became the first in 27 BC, through to Commodus, who died in 192 AD, more than half died violently. Assassinated by the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers whose stated purpose was to protect the emperor but who became, over time, the single most dangerous force in Roman politics. The guard that was supposed to be the emperor's shield became, again and again, his greatest threat. Emperors bribed them for loyalty. Emperors feared them in private. And when an emperor fell out of favor with his own protectors, the consequences were swift and almost always fatal. The Praetorian Guard at its height numbered somewhere between 9,000 and 16,000 men. They were paid significantly more than regular legionary soldiers. They served shorter terms. They were stationed in and around Rome itself, the only armed force permitted within the city walls, which gave them an access to the emperor that no other military unit possessed. And they used that access. They made and unmade emperors with a frequency that would be almost comic if the stakes had not been so consistently lethal. On one particularly chaotic occasion in 193 AD, a year historians call the Year of the Five Emperors, the guard literally auctioned off the position of emperor to the highest bidder. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus outbid his rival and purchased the throne of Rome at public auction. He lasted 66 days before being executed. The absurdity of that moment, the throne of the most powerful empire in the world going to the man who raised his hand highest, reveals something important about Rome. That beneath the marble and the grandeur and the mythology of eternal power, the city ran on very human dynamics. On ambition and fear and money, and the constant negotiation between those who held formal authority and those who held actual force. Rome was never as stable as it looked from the outside. It was always, underneath, a very complicated argument about who was really in charge. But while emperors rose and fell on the Palatine Hill, while the Praetorian Guard shifted their allegiances and the Senate performed its careful theater of deliberation, the city below simply continued. The Thermopolia opened in the morning. The baths filled with steam. The water ran through the aqueducts. Children went to school. And Roman children went to school in a way that would feel surprisingly familiar to a modern eye, and surprisingly demanding. Education in Rome was taken seriously, particularly among the upper and middle classes. Boys, and sometimes girls, depending on the family, began their formal education around the age of 7, studying reading, writing, and arithmetic under a teacher called a literator. Classes were held early in the morning, often outdoors or in rented spaces, and the school day began at dawn and could last until mid-afternoon. There were no desks as we know them. Students sat on stools or on the ground, writing on wooden tablets coated in wax, using a pointed stylus to scratch letters into the surface. The wax could be smoothed flat and used again, making the tablet the ancient equivalent of a whiteboard. Mistakes were erased with the blunt end of the stylus, and the lesson continued. By the time a Roman boy of good family reached his early teens, he moved on to a more advanced teacher called a grammaticus, who taught literature, history, Greek, philosophy, and the foundations of rhetoric. Greek was considered essential, the language of culture, of philosophy, of medicine and science. An educated Roman was expected to be effectively bilingual, switching between Latin and Greek the way a modern educated European might move between their native language and English. Many of Rome's greatest writers wrote in both languages. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius, one of the finest minds to ever sit on the Roman throne, wrote his personal philosophical journal, the work we now call Meditations, entirely in Greek rather than Latin. A Roman emperor, writing his private thoughts in a foreign language, because that language felt more suited to the depth of what he was trying to say. Meditations was never intended to be published. It was a private document, notes that Marcus wrote to himself during military campaigns, in the evenings, after the day's decisions had been made and the dispatches sent, and the business of ruling concluded. Reminders of how to be better, how to remain calm, how to lead without ego, how to face death with equanimity. The entries are short, often just a few sentences, addressed to himself in the second person, as if he were speaking to a friend he was disappointed in but had not given up on. They read, even now, like something written last week rather than 2,000 years ago. The anxieties are recognizable. The struggle to be patient, to let go of anger, to focus on what can be controlled and release what cannot. All of it as immediate and as human as anything being written today. He was, by most accounts, a genuinely good man in a role that tended to corrupt. He did not want to be emperor. He had been adopted by his predecessor specifically to be groomed for the position, and he accepted it as a duty rather than a prize. He spent much of his reign not in Rome but on the frontier, commanding armies against the Germanic tribes pressing against the empire's northern borders, writing his private philosophy by lamplight in his campaign tent, while the empire he had not asked for pressed down on him from every direction. The lamp burns low in the campaign tent. Outside, the northern night is cold and vast, so different from the warmth of Rome. The river that marks the empire's edge murmurs somewhere in the dark. The sentries move at their posts. And inside, a man who rules the known world is writing a reminder to himself to be kinder tomorrow than he was today. There is something deeply settling about that image. That even at the absolute apex of human power, what a person found themselves returning to, in the quiet of the night, was the same small work that everyone returns to. The work of trying to be better, of trying to stay calm, of trying, against the weight of everything, to be good. Rome understood that work. The city had been doing it, in its imperfect and magnificent way, for centuries. And it would keep doing it for centuries more. The Palatine Hill stands quiet above the sleeping city. The palace windows are dark. The forum below is silver in the moonlight, the temples rising pale and still, the columns throwing long shadows across the empty stone. Somewhere, a fountain is running. It is always running. There is a sound that Rome made that no other city in the ancient world could quite replicate. It was not the roar of the crowd in the Colosseum, though that was extraordinary. It was not the clatter of the night carts or the echo of voices in the bathhouses, or even the particular acoustics of a great speech rolling out across the forum. It was something quieter than all of those. Something that ran beneath everything else, constant and unceasing, the way a river runs beneath ice in winter. It was the sound of water. Always water. Falling into basins, running through channels, spilling over the lips of fountains into the pools below. In a city without the hum of electricity, without engines or machinery, the sound of moving water was everywhere, and the Romans had put it there deliberately, had engineered it into the fabric of the city as consciously as they had engineered the roads and the sewers, because they understood, in some deep and intuitive way, that a city full of the sound of water is a city that feels alive without feeling threatening. Soothing, continuous, human. Rome at its peak had over 1,000 fountains. Not decorative features placed carefully in grand piazzas for tourists to photograph, but functional, practical, public fountains scattered throughout every neighborhood, every street corner, every district of the city. Called lakes, in their small domestic way, they were the water source for the majority of the city's population, who had no running water in their homes. You went to the fountain with a jug. You filled it. You carried it back. And the fountain was always there, always running, because the aqueducts never stopped and the water never ran out. Fresh mountain water, clean and cold, available to every person in the city at any hour of the day or night, regardless of their wealth or status. In this one thing, Rome was genuinely democratic. The water that fed those fountains came from sources sometimes 60 or 70 kilometers away, carried on aqueducts that crossed valleys and cut through hillsides in a feat of sustained engineering patience that is still difficult to fully comprehend. And to keep all of that water flowing, to maintain the channels and repair the breaks and clear the mineral deposits that built up inside the stone over time, Rome employed a dedicated workforce of water engineers. The curator aquarum, the superintendent of waters, was one of the most important administrative positions in the city. Below him, a hierarchy of engineers and inspectors and laborers worked continuously, walking the length of the aqueducts, checking for leaks, monitoring flow rates, ensuring that the system that kept the city alive was itself kept alive. It was a job that never ended. The aqueducts required constant attention, constant maintenance, constant human presence. And the men who did that work understood the city in a way that no senator or emperor ever truly could. Not as an idea or a symbol or a political entity, but as a physical thing, a machine of stone and water and gravity that had to be tended and watched and cared for every single day, or it would fail. Cities are always, underneath their grandeur, a maintenance problem. Rome just happened to be the largest and most complicated maintenance problem the ancient world had ever attempted. Beyond the fountains, beyond the sound of water falling through the night, the city's neighborhoods each had their own particular character. Rome was not a uniform place. It was a collection of distinct districts, each with its own population, its own rhythms, its own reputation. The Suburra, for instance, was the most densely populated and notoriously chaotic neighborhood in all of Rome. It sat in the valley between the Esquiline and Viminal hills, low-lying and crowded, packed with insulae that rose so high on either side of the narrow streets that sunlight barely reached the ground. It was loud and smelly and vital and dangerous, full of taverns and brothels and workshops and market stalls and the full impossible variety of human life crammed into too small a space. Julius Caesar grew up in the Suburra. Before the wealth and the power and the marble statues, before the dictatorship and the assassination and the immortality, he was a boy from one of Rome's roughest neighborhoods, navigating those narrow streets with the particular alertness of someone who has learned early that the world is not automatically safe. Some historians believe that his understanding of ordinary Romans, his instinct for what the population needed and wanted, his ease with soldiers and common people that so distinguished him from many of his aristocratic peers, was shaped in large part by those early years in the Suburra. The neighborhood made the man, the way neighborhoods always do. The contrast between the Suburra and the Palatine Hill, between the cramped darkness of the valley and the airy privilege of the heights, was one of the defining tensions of Roman life. Rome was an extraordinarily unequal society, and that inequality was written into the physical landscape of the city in ways that were impossible to ignore. The wealthy lived elevated, literally above the noise and smell, with views and light and space. The poor lived below, compressed, in buildings that were frequently dangerous and almost always uncomfortable. Roman insulae, the apartment buildings that housed the majority of the city's population, were a marvel and a misery in equal measure. At their best, they were well-built, reasonably spacious, and located on good streets with easy access to fountains and food. At their worst, they were death traps. Poorly constructed by landlords more interested in maximizing rental income than structural integrity, rising 6 or 7 stories on foundations that were not always adequate for the weight above, prone to sudden collapse and even more prone to fire. The Emperor Augustus, appalled by the constant threat of buildings simply falling down on people, passed a law limiting the height of insulae to around 20 meters. His successor Nero, after the Great Fire of 64 AD burned a significant portion of the city, imposed even stricter building regulations. Wider streets, mandatory stone or brick construction for the lower floors, required gaps between buildings to slow the spread of fire. The Great Fire of 64 AD deserves a moment of its own. It began, most likely, in the merchant shops around the Circus Maximus on a hot July night, the vast chariot racing stadium whose wooden stands and storage areas were essentially a city block of ready kindling. Once started, the fire spread with a speed and ferocity that overwhelmed every attempt to contain it. It burned for 6 days before being brought under control, then reignited and burned for 3 more. When it was finally out, 10 of Rome's 14 administrative districts had been damaged or destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people were left homeless. Ancient temples that had stood for centuries were gone. The city that emerged from the ashes was, in significant ways, a different city from the one that had burned. The Emperor Nero responded to the disaster in ways that history has remembered very differently at different times. He opened his own gardens and public buildings to the homeless. He organized the distribution of food. He commissioned a rapid rebuilding program that would make the new Rome more orderly and more fire-resistant than the old. But he also, and this is the part that history has debated ever since, built himself an extraordinary new palace on land cleared by the fire. The Domus Aurea, the Golden House. A complex so vast it covered somewhere between 100 and 300 acres in the heart of the city, with a rotating dining room, ceilings that sprayed guests with flower petals, and a colossal bronze statue of Nero himself, over 30 meters tall, standing at the entrance. Whether Nero started the fire himself, whether the famous story of him playing his lyre and singing while Rome burned contains any truth, is almost certainly not the case. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing closest to the events, noted that Nero was away from the city when the fire began and returned to oversee relief efforts. But the story of the singing emperor stuck, and stories that stick tend to do so because they capture something emotionally true even when they are factually false. Nero was, by most accounts, a deeply theatrical person, someone who craved performance and attention and artistic recognition in ways that sat uneasily with the dignity that Romans expected of their emperors. He competed publicly in chariot races and singing competitions, and fixed them so he would win. He had his own mother killed. He kicked his pregnant wife to death. He was, by any measure, a man of extraordinary gifts and extraordinary cruelty, and the story of him performing while his city burned captured the essence of that contradiction so perfectly that it became immortal regardless of its accuracy. After Nero came the Flavian emperors, and after them the 5 good emperors, a succession of rulers so effective and so capable that the historian Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century, called their combined reign the period in human history during which the condition of the human race was most happy and most prosperous. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius. 5 emperors, spanning nearly a century, each one adopting and carefully selecting his successor rather than relying on the biological lottery of hereditary succession. The result was, by the standards of Roman imperial history, a period of remarkable stability, competent governance, and territorial expansion. Trajan, the second of the 5, pushed the empire to its greatest ever extent, crossing the Danube to conquer Dacia, the territory of modern Romania, and later campaigning deep into Mesopotamia. Under Trajan, the Roman Empire reached its maximum size. It would never be larger. And Trajan commemorated his Dacian victory in a way that still stands in Rome today. A column, 30 meters high, its entire surface carved in a continuous spiral narrative depicting the campaign from beginning to end. Trajan's Column. 2,000 individual figures carved in relief, telling a story in stone that winds upward like a slow and patient scroll, and which archaeologists are still studying and arguing about today. 2,000 figures, spiraling upward toward the sky. Soldiers crossing rivers on pontoon bridges. Battles fought in forests and on open plains. Prisoners bound and marching. Trophies carried in triumph. And at the very top, a statue, originally of Trajan himself, replaced in the 16th century with a statue of Saint Peter that stands there still. A Roman emperor replaced by a Christian saint, on a column that was already ancient when the Renaissance began. That layering, that accumulation of meanings over time, is perhaps the most Roman thing about it. Rome was always being reinterpreted, always having new meanings written over old ones, new faiths built on old foundations, new stories told in spaces where older stories had already soaked into the stone. The column stands in the moonlight. The carved figures are silver and shadow. 2,000 people frozen in the act of crossing a river that most of them would never see again, preserved in stone for 2 millennia, still telling their story to anyone patient enough to look. Let the column stand above you, quiet and enormous, as the night deepens around the city. Let the water run in the fountains below. Let Rome breathe, slow and steady, all around you. There is a particular quality to the middle of the night in a very old city. Not the early night, when the last lamps are still burning in the taverns and voices still drift up from the streets below. Not the early morning, when the first light is already beginning to soften the darkness and the carts are making their final runs before dawn forces them away. But the middle. The still point. The hour when even Rome, with all its noise and appetite and restless energy, finally exhaled. In that stillness, if you listened carefully, you could hear the city's age. The weight of it. Rome had not always been the marble city of emperors and aqueducts and 1 million people pressing against each other in its narrow streets. It had started as something far more modest. A collection of settlements on hilltops above a river. Shepherds and farmers and traders, drawn together by geography and necessity, speaking a language that would one day become the root of half the languages of Europe, but which in those earliest centuries was just the tongue of one small community among many, in a peninsula full of competing peoples and city-states. The traditional founding date of Rome is 753 BC. That date was calculated by Roman scholars working centuries after the fact, using a combination of historical records, genealogies, and mythology, and it should be understood more as a cultural anchor than a precise historical fact. but what it represents is real enough. A moment, somewhere in the 8th century before the Common Era, when the settlements on those hills began to coalesce into something that thought of itself as a single place. A city. And from that moment, Rome began its long, improbable, extraordinary journey toward becoming the center of the world. The story Rome told about its own founding was, like most founding myths, a story about violence and destiny intertwined. Romulus and Remus, twin brothers, sons of the war god Mars and a Vestal Virgin named Rhea Silvia, abandoned as infants on the banks of the Tiber by a great uncle who feared their claim to power. Left to die in the river's shallows. And then found, according to the story, by a she-wolf, who carried them to her den beneath the Palatine Hill, and nursed them as if they were her own cubs. The image of the twins at the wolf's side, the Capitoline wolf, as the famous bronze sculpture is called, became one of the most enduring symbols in all of human history. The idea of Rome as something wild at its root, something that had been suckled not on comfort and safety but on the raw, animal vitality of survival. Tough from the beginning, fierce from the very first breath. Romulus eventually killed Remus in a dispute over the boundaries of the new city, an act of fratricide built into the foundation myth of civilization's greatest empire, and one that Romans themselves found deeply meaningful. They told that story not to hide it, but to carry it forward. The shadow at the beginning, the violence underneath the order. As if Rome knew, from its very first moment, that it would never be entirely clean. After the kings came the Republic, and after the Republic came the emperors, and through all of those centuries and all of those transformations, one institution remained constant. One group of women held a position of such unique and extraordinary power that even emperors treated them with deference. The Vestal Virgins. There were 6 of them at any given time. Selected between the ages of 6 and 10 from noble Roman families, they served for 30 years, 10 years learning their duties, 10 years performing them, 10 years teaching the next generation. Their primary responsibility was the maintenance of the sacred flame in the temple of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth. That flame was never allowed to go out. It had been burning, Romans believed, since the earliest days of the city, and its continued burning was understood to be directly connected to the continued survival of Rome itself. If the flame went out, it was considered a catastrophic omen, and the Vestal responsible was flogged. In exchange for this service, for these 30 years of celibacy and sacred duty, the Vestals received something that almost no other woman in Rome possessed: legal independence. They could own property in their own names. They could make wills. They could give evidence in court without a male guardian present. They had reserved seats at the games, directly across from the emperor's box, the best seats in any arena. When a Vestal moved through the streets of Rome in her white robes, lictors, the official attendants who normally preceded only magistrates and emperors, walked before her to clear the way. Even a condemned man being led to execution would be pardoned on the spot if a Vestal crossed his path. The flame they tended burned in a round temple at the edge of the Forum, a building whose circular shape was said to echo the round huts of Rome's earliest settlements, a deliberate architectural memory of the city's origins preserved in stone at the center of everything. And beside the temple stood the house of the Vestals, a large, comfortable, well-appointed residence built around a central garden, with its own staff and its own resources, a home that was, by the standards of Roman women's lives, a place of remarkable dignity and comfort. The vow of chastity that the Vestals took was absolute. and the punishment for breaking it was one of the most severe in all of Roman law. A Vestal found guilty of unchastity was not executed openly. That would have been considered a desecration, since her body was sacred. Instead, she was placed alive in a small underground chamber near the Colline Gate, with enough food and water for a few days, and the entrance was sealed. Rome did not kill her. It simply stopped maintaining the conditions necessary for her to remain alive. The distinction mattered enormously to the Romans, even if it is difficult to find much comfort in it. But these punishments were rare. Most Vestals served their 30 years with great honor and returned to ordinary life afterward, free to marry if they chose, though few did, perhaps because the independence and status they had enjoyed for 3 decades was difficult to exchange for the legal subordination that marriage in Rome typically entailed. Some Vestals became figures of enormous public influence, consulted by emperors, their opinions sought on matters of state, their endorsement of a political figure carrying real weight in the always complicated calculations of Roman public life. They were, in their quiet and particular way, among the most powerful women in the ancient world. Speaking of power, Rome's relationship with the gods who granted it was one of the most complex and pragmatic in the ancient world. Roman religion was not, in the way that the great monotheistic faiths are, a matter of personal belief and exclusive devotion. It was more like a vast ongoing negotiation. The Romans worshipped many gods, dozens of them, eventually hundreds, as the empire expanded and foreign deities were absorbed and incorporated into the Roman pantheon. Jupiter and Juno and Mars and Venus and Minerva at the center, but room at the edges for Isis from Egypt and Mithras from Persia and the Magna Mater from Anatolia, and eventually, in the empire's final centuries, the Christian God who would outlast them all. The Roman attitude toward these deities was fundamentally contractual. Do ut da? I give so that you might give. You performed the correct rituals, made the correct sacrifices, observed the correct festivals, and in return the gods were expected to hold up their end of the arrangement. They would grant victory in battle, good harvests, healthy children, favorable winds for ships. If things went wrong, if Rome lost a battle, if the harvest failed, if disease swept through the city, it was likely because someone had failed to observe the proper rites. The gods were not angry in a personal sense. They were simply parties to a contract that had been breached. This contractual view of religion meant that Rome was, in its own way, remarkably religiously tolerant, at least until the later empire. Conquered peoples were generally allowed to keep their own gods, provided they also honored the Roman ones. Foreign deities were welcomed into the pantheon rather than suppressed. New cults arrived with traders and soldiers from across the empire and found audiences in Rome with relative ease. The city was a religious marketplace as much as a commercial one, full of competing traditions and overlapping beliefs and the particular spiritual restlessness of a population drawn from every corner of the known world. The one thing Rome struggled to tolerate was exclusivity. The claim that a single god was the only god, that other gods did not exist or should not be worshipped. This was the sticking point with both Judaism and Christianity, and it created real friction. An empire built on religious pluralism found monotheism difficult to accommodate, not because the Romans were hostile to the content of these beliefs, but because the refusal to participate in the shared religious life of the empire, to make the required sacrifices, to honor the emperor as a divine or semi-divine figure, looked, from Rome's perspective, less like religion and more like sedition. And yet Christianity survived. More than survived, it grew, quietly and persistently, through the centuries of Roman rule. Meeting in private homes, spreading through trade networks and personal connections, moving along those same Roman roads that had been built for armies and tax collectors, carried by ordinary people from city to city across the empire. By the time the Emperor Constantine converted in the early 4th century AD, making Christianity the favored religion of the empire and eventually its official faith, there were already Christian communities in virtually every major city from Britain to Mesopotamia. Constantine's conversion is one of the great pivot points of Western history. In a single reign, a faith that had been periodically persecuted became the faith of the most powerful institution in the world. The churches that replaced temples. The bishops who inherited the organizational structures of Roman administration. The Latin language in which the church would conduct its affairs for more than 1,000 years, all of it flowing from that moment in the early 4th century when a Roman emperor looked at the cross and decided to march under it. The night is very deep now. The temples are quiet on their hills, their flames tended by priests who have performed these same rituals 10,000 times before, who will perform them 10,000 times again without knowing that the world they are maintaining is already, slowly and invisibly, changing shape around them. The roads stretch away into the dark in every direction. Along them, in the small hours, a traveler is moving. A merchant, perhaps. Or a soldier returning home. Or a person carrying a letter that will change something somewhere, in ways they cannot yet imagine. Above, the stars are the same stars they have always been. Indifferent to empires. Patient beyond measure. Rome breathes beneath them, enormous and alive, unaware of its own mortality. As all great things are. There is something that happens in the very deepest part of the night, in the hours just before the first pale suggestion of dawn begins to soften the eastern sky, when the world seems to pause between one breath and the next. Rome knew that pause, had always known it, had built itself, over centuries, into a city that understood the full range of human experience from the loudest noon to the quietest pre-dawn stillness, and had found ways to fill every hour with something worth remembering. And in those quietest hours, when the forum was empty and the baths were closed, and even the most dedicated tavern keeper had finally shuttered his door and gone to sleep, the city's memory kept working. Kept turning over its long and complicated past the way a person turns over a thought they cannot quite let go of. Because Rome remembered everything, or tried to. The Romans were, among their many remarkable qualities, extraordinarily devoted to the idea of memory, to the preservation of the past, to the recording of events, to the construction of monuments that would outlast the people who built them and carry some trace of their existence forward into a future they could not see. The triumphal arches that still stand in Rome today were not built for beauty, though they are beautiful. They were built to remember, to fix a moment in stone so firmly that time itself could not entirely erase it. The Arch of Titus, standing at the entrance to the Roman Forum, was built after the Emperor Titus's destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. It shows, in its carved interior panels, the spoils of the temple being carried in triumph through Rome, the great menorah, the silver trumpets, the golden table. It is one of the most detailed and historically significant reliefs in all of Roman art, a record of a moment of enormous consequence carved by the people who caused it. For centuries, Jewish visitors to Rome would not walk beneath that arch. Some still do not. A piece of stone, 2,000 years old, still carrying enough weight to shape the behavior of living people. That is what Roman memory could do. The Romans built their memory in stone because they understood that other materials failed. Wood rotted, paint faded, even bronze could be melted down and recast as something else, as so much Roman bronze eventually was, in the desperate centuries when the empire needed metal more than it needed monuments. But stone, properly quarried and properly cut, could survive almost anything, could survive fire and flood, and the slow patient erosion of centuries, and the deliberate destruction of enemies, and the simple indifference of time. The stone they reached for most often, for their greatest buildings, their most important monuments, their most enduring structures, was a particular volcanic rock quarried from the hills around Rome. Travertine. Warm in color, cream to honey to the palest gold depending on the light, strong enough to bear enormous weight, workable enough to be cut and carved with precision. The Colosseum is travertine. The Arch of Constantine is travertine. The colonnade of St. Peter's Basilica, built 15 centuries after the height of the empire, is travertine quarried from the same hills the Romans used. A material so well suited to its purpose that successive civilizations kept reaching for it, kept finding it the right answer to the question of how to build something meant to last. But Rome's most revolutionary building material was not travertine. It was something far more ordinary-looking and far more extraordinary in its implications. It was concrete. Roman concrete, opus cementitium, was not the same as modern concrete, though it served the same basic purpose. It was a mixture of volcanic ash, called pozzolana, combined with lime and seawater and aggregate, chunks of rock, broken brick, rubble, poured into wooden forms and left to set. The volcanic ash was the crucial ingredient, the thing that made Roman concrete different from anything that had come before. When pozzolana reacts with seawater and lime, it forms mineral crystals that continue to grow and strengthen over time rather than weakening. Modern concrete, by contrast, begins to degrade almost from the moment it sets. Cracks form, water gets in, corrosion begins its slow work. Roman concrete, properly made, gets stronger as it ages. This is not a poetic exaggeration. Material scientists who have studied Roman harbor structures, concrete poured directly into the sea 2,000 years ago, have found that the concrete is in better condition today than modern equivalents would be after a fraction of that time. The mineral crystals that formed as the concrete cured are still growing, still strengthening. The sea, rather than destroying the concrete, has been slowly improving it for 20 centuries. With that concrete, Rome built things that had never been built before. Most dramatically, it built the dome. The Pantheon, still standing in Rome, still in use, still the best preserved ancient building in the world, was completed around 125 AD under the Emperor Hadrian, though it was built on the site of an earlier temple. Its dome is a perfect hemisphere, 142 Roman feet in diameter, and for 13 centuries after it was built it remained the largest dome in the world. No one built a larger one until Brunelleschi completed the dome of the Florence Cathedral in 1436, and Brunelleschi studied the Pantheon carefully before he began. The dome of the United States Capitol building was designed with the Pantheon in mind. The dome of the Pantheon's influence stretches across 2,000 years of architecture, and the building itself stands in Rome today, visited by millions of people every year, its concrete as solid as the day it was poured. At the very top of the dome is an opening, the oculus, the eye. A circular hole 9 meters across, open to the sky, unglazed, with nothing between the interior of the building and the elements above it. Rain falls through it when it rains. Sunlight pours through it in a moving column that tracks across the interior walls and floors as the day progresses, turning the building itself into a kind of sundial. When an emperor entered the Pantheon and stood beneath the oculus, the column of light fell on him, or could be timed to fall on him, in a way that made it look as if the heavens themselves were illuminating him specifically. Architecture as theology. Stone and light arranged to make a political point about the relationship between rulers and gods. Hadrian, who completed the Pantheon, was one of the most traveled and most intellectually curious emperors Rome ever produced. Where many emperors ruled from Rome, directing their empire through dispatches and intermediaries, Hadrian spent the majority of his reign traveling. He visited almost every province of the empire: Britain, Gaul, Spain, North Africa, Egypt, Greece, Asia Minor, the eastern frontiers, moving through his domains with a restless, observant energy, inspecting troops and building projects and administrative arrangements, asking questions, taking notes, drawing conclusions. He was an architect himself, or considered himself one, and he left physical traces of his presence across the empire in the form of buildings and walls and urban improvements that bear his personal imprint. The most famous of these is in the north of Britain. Hadrian's Wall, stretching from coast to coast across the narrowest part of the British island, roughly 118 kilometers from the Solway Firth in the west to the mouth of the River Tyne in the east, was built beginning around 122 AD, during Hadrian's visit to the province of Britannia. It was not, as it is sometimes understood, simply a military barrier against the peoples of what is now Scotland. It was a controlled border, a customs and administrative line, with gates at regular intervals, and forts and mile castles positioned along its length. It was designed to regulate movement rather than simply prevent it, to know who was crossing from one side to the other, to tax goods, to monitor the frontier. A border in the modern sense, made of stone, at the edge of the known world. Hadrian loved Greece with a devotion that his Roman contemporaries sometimes found excessive. He studied Greek philosophy, wore a Greek-style beard at a time when most Romans were clean-shaven, and spent extended periods in Athens, the city he loved above all others. He completed the Temple of Olympian Zeus in Athens, a project that had been begun 6 centuries earlier and abandoned. Hadrian simply decided it should be finished, and finished it was. He was made an Athenian citizen. He was worshipped as a god in the Greek East during his own lifetime, a practice the more reserved Romans of the western provinces found somewhat uncomfortable. He also, unusually for a Roman emperor, had a love that he acknowledged publicly and mourned openly. His companion Antinous, a young man from the province of Bithynia in what is now northern Turkey, traveled with Hadrian for years, a constant presence at his side. In 130 AD, Antinous drowned in the Nile under circumstances that have never been fully explained. Hadrian's grief was, by ancient accounts, extreme and unrestrained. He wept openly, which Romans considered beneath imperial dignity. He founded a city in Egypt on the site of the drowning and named it Antinopolis. He had Antinous deified, made into a god, and promoted his worship across the empire with an enthusiasm and sincerity that was unmistakably personal. Statues of Antinous were produced in enormous numbers. More surviving portraits of Antinous exist today than of almost any other person from the ancient world outside of the emperors themselves. There is something in that fact that lingers. All those faces, carved in marble across the empire. A young man from a provincial town, unknown and unremarkable by birth, made immortal by the particular accident of being loved by the most powerful person in the world at the moment of his death. His face reproduced hundreds of times, sent to the farthest corners of the empire, placed in temples and public spaces and private homes, so that everywhere Hadrian went in the years that remained to him, he would see that face looking back. The Romans were, underneath all the grandeur and the law and the engineering, remarkably human in their grief, in the way loss moved through them, in the way they reached for stone and permanence when the thing they loved was gone, as if building something solid enough might hold the shape of what had been lost, as if memory, properly made, could substitute for presence. It cannot. It never can. But it is a very human thing to try. And Rome tried, across all its centuries, with everything it had. The city breathes in the deep dark around you. The monuments stand patient in the moonlight. The fountains run. The stone holds everything it was asked to hold, and then a little more. Rest now. Let it all grow still. The dawn was still a long way off. But somewhere in the city, somewhere in the warm layered dark of Rome at its deepest hour, a baker was already awake. Had been awake for hours, in fact. Because bread in Rome did not simply appear. It had to be made in the night, so that it would be ready in the morning, so that the city could eat before it had fully decided to be conscious. The Roman bakery, the pastrinum, was a place of extraordinary activity in the hours when the rest of the city slept. The millstones turning, driven by donkeys walking their slow circles in the dark. The dough worked by hand in large wooden troughs. The ovens, fueled by wood, burning at temperatures that filled the bakery with a fierce dry heat even in the coldest months. And the bakers themselves, moving through all of it with the particular focused efficiency of people who have done the same thing so many times that their bodies know what to do before their minds have finished waking up. Bread was not merely important to Rome. It was foundational in a way that is difficult to fully convey. The Roman state distributed free grain, and later free bread, to a significant portion of the city's population as a matter of official policy. At its height, the grain dole, called the annona, fed somewhere between 100 and 200,000 people in Rome every single day. Free. Unconditionally. Simply because they were Roman citizens living in the city, and the state had decided that a hungry population was a dangerous one, and that the cost of feeding people was always less than the cost of the instability that hunger produced. The grain came from across the empire, from Egypt most importantly, which was so productive and so essential to Rome's food supply that Augustus, when he took control of it after defeating Cleopatra and Mark Antony, refused to allow any senator to visit the province without his personal permission. Egypt was too important to risk in the hands of someone with political ambitions. It was, in effect, the emperor's personal grain farm, and the fleet of ships that carried its harvest to Rome, enormous grain freighters, the largest cargo vessels the ancient world had ever built, was one of the most consequential logistical operations in human history. The ships that carried that grain were marvels in their own right. Roman merchant vessels, particularly the large grain carriers called naves honorarii, could be extraordinarily large by ancient standards. Some of the biggest were over 50 meters in length, capable of carrying several hundred tons of grain in a single voyage. They crossed the Mediterranean with a confidence and regularity that reflected centuries of accumulated maritime knowledge, reading the seasonal winds, timing departures to take advantage of favorable conditions, running established routes between Alexandria and the great harbor at Ostia, Rome's port city at the mouth of the Tiber. Ostia was Rome's connection to the sea, and through the sea to everything beyond. It was a proper city in its own right. Not just a port, but a place where people lived and worked and raised families, where warehouses lined the streets for blocks in every direction, where merchants from every part of the Mediterranean had their offices and their agents and their contacts. Excavations at Ostia have given archaeologists some of their clearest windows into the texture of ordinary Roman commercial life. The guild halls where associations of traders and craftspeople met, the thermopolia and taverns where they ate and drank, the apartment buildings where they slept, the temples where they prayed to the gods of commerce and safe sailing. From Ostia, the goods of the world moved inland to Rome. Not just grain but everything: wine from Gaul and Spain, olive oil from North Africa, marble from Greece and Turkey, glassware from Syria, papyrus from Egypt, silk from the Far East carried overland along the Silk Road and loaded onto ships at eastern Mediterranean ports, spices from India and Arabia arriving via the Red Sea trade routes that Roman merchants navigated with increasing confidence from the 1st century AD onward. The scale of Roman trade is one of the aspects of the ancient world that most consistently surprises modern people. We tend to imagine the ancient world as small and local, each community largely self-sufficient, connected to others only tenuously and occasionally. Rome was the opposite of that. It was a globalized economy in the most meaningful sense of the word, a network of exchange that linked the shores of Britain to the coasts of India, that moved goods across thousands of kilometers as a matter of routine commercial practice, that created demand in Rome for products that could only be obtained at the very edges of the known world and beyond. Roman coins have been found in India. Roman glassware has been found in China. A Roman trading post has been identified on the southeastern coast of India, at a site called Arachimidu, where archaeologists have found Roman amphorae and lamps and coins in abundance. The world was not as disconnected as we sometimes imagine. And at the center of its connections, pulling goods and people and ideas toward itself like a great commercial and cultural gravity, was Rome. All of that wealth, all of those goods flowing into the city from every direction, had to be managed, stored, distributed, taxed, recorded. And Rome had developed, over centuries, a commercial and financial infrastructure of remarkable sophistication to handle it. Roman merchants used contracts, letters of credit, partnerships, and loans with interest in ways that would be recognizable to a modern businessperson. They had banks, or at least institutions that functioned as banks, accepting deposits, making loans, transferring funds between cities through a system of written orders that allowed a merchant in Rome to make payment to a supplier in Alexandria without physically moving any coins at all. The Roman financial system was not identical to modern banking, but it rhymes with it in ways that are striking. And at its heart was an understanding that money was not just metal, that credit, properly arranged and properly trusted, could do the work of money without requiring the physical substance to change hands. This insight, which feels like a modern one, was alive and operational in Rome 2,000 years ago. With wealth came leisure, and with leisure came culture, and Rome's cultural life was richer and stranger and more various than most people expect. The Romans loved theater. Not just the gladiatorial spectacles of the arena, though they loved those too, but proper theatrical performance. Comedies, tragedies, farces, mime shows, pantomimes in which a single performer would take multiple roles, shifting between characters with changes of mask and gesture while a chorus sang the narrative. The great Roman playwrights, Plautus and Terence in the Republican period, Seneca in the Imperial, wrote works that have survived and are still performed today. Plautus in particular was a genius of comedy, and his plots, mistaken identities, scheming servants outwitting pompous masters, young men in love thwarted by circumstance and aided by clever friends, were so fundamentally funny that Shakespeare borrowed several of them wholesale nearly 1,500 years later, including the plot of the Comedy of Errors. The theaters themselves were extraordinary spaces. Unlike Greek theaters, which were carved into hillsides and used the natural slope for seating, Roman theaters were freestanding structures, built on flat ground with their own artificial seating arrangements, making them far more flexible in terms of where they could be placed. The stage buildings behind the performance area were elaborate facades of columns and niches and statues, multiple stories high, providing a permanent architectural backdrop that could serve as the setting for any play. Some Roman theaters could seat tens of thousands of people. The Theatre of Marcellus in Rome, which still partially stands and now has apartments built into its upper arches, held between 10 and 20,000. And crucially, at least for the performances that emperors and wealthy patrons funded, the audience was covered. An enormous retractable awning, called a velarium, was rigged above the seating area of large Roman entertainment venues, including the Colosseum, to protect the crowd from sun and rain. Operating this awning was a specialist job requiring a team of sailors from the imperial fleet, who understood rigging and rope and the management of large fabric structures in the wind. Sailors brought inland to manage an awning over an arena, so that the citizens of Rome could watch gladiators in comfort regardless of the weather. The attention to the audience's comfort, the awning against the sun, the free admission, the elaborate spectacle staged at imperial expense, reflects something important about the Roman understanding of the relationship between the state and its people. Rome was not a democracy in the modern sense, but it was not indifferent to popular opinion either. Emperors who lost the support of the crowd at the games, who were booed, who were publicly shamed in the arena, faced real political consequences. The crowd's verdict on an emperor's performance, delivered in the raw and unfiltered acoustics of the Colosseum, was one of the few forms of genuine political feedback available in a system without elections. And so emperors paid attention. They appeared at the games. They sat in the imperial box and were watched in return, performing their own role in the great theater of Roman public life. Some genuinely enjoyed it. Some found it tedious or distasteful, but understood its necessity. The crowd knew the difference, the way crowds always do, and they responded accordingly. An emperor who seemed present, engaged, generous, interested in the same spectacle as his people. That emperor felt the warmth of 50,000 people approving of him simultaneously, a sensation that no amount of senatorial flattery could replicate. The crowd that filled those arenas was itself a kind of Rome in miniature. Every class, every occupation, every neighborhood represented. Senators in their broad-striped togas in the lower tiers. Equestrians above them. Ordinary citizens filling the middle ranks. Women and the poor at the very top, the seats farthest from the action and most exposed to the elements, but seats nonetheless, because everyone had a place, and Rome had decided, deliberately and as a matter of policy, that the spectacle belonged to all of them equally. In the crowd were people whose names we will never know. A fisherman from Ostia who had walked to Rome for the games and would walk back tomorrow. A freedwoman who had saved for months for this visit. A child perched on a father's shoulders, seeing the Colosseum for the first time, the scale of it making the world feel briefly larger than it had ever seemed before. All of them are gone now. all of them present then, in that roar, in that particular shared attention that 50,000 people can create when they are all looking at the same thing at the same moment. There is nothing quite like it. There never has been. And Rome invented it. The city holds all of them still, in its stones and its silences, in the worn curves of its steps and the particular quality of the light on its walls at dusk. All those vanished people, held in stone. Rest with them a while. The city was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to change. Not the Rome outside the window. That Rome was still deep in its nighttime self, the streets quiet, the fountains running, the monuments standing patient and silver in the moonlight as they always had and always would. No, the change was subtler than that. It was the change that happens in the air itself in the hour before dawn, when the darkness shifts from the deep black of midnight to something slightly thinner, slightly more permeable, as if the night is beginning to remember that it has an edge. Rome had seen a great many dawns, more than anyone could count. It had watched the light come back over the hills 10,000 times, 100,000 times, across the centuries of its long and extraordinary life. And each dawn was the same, and each dawn was different, because the city that watched it was always slightly changed from the city that had watched the one before. Always accumulating, always becoming. That quality of accumulation, of a civilization building on itself, each generation inheriting and adding to and sometimes subtracting from what came before, was perhaps the most essentially Roman of all Roman qualities. Rome did not believe in starting from nothing. It believed in the weight of precedent, in the authority of tradition, in the value of what had been done before as a guide to what should be done now. The Latin word for this was mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors, the customs and practices and moral standards of the generations that had come before, understood not as arbitrary rules but as accumulated wisdom, tested by time and therefore trustworthy in a way that new ideas, however brilliant, could never quite be. The mos maiorum was not a written document. It had no single authoritative text, no tablets on which it was inscribed, no official keeper or interpreter. It lived instead in the collective memory of the Roman people, in the stories they told about their ancestors, in the examples they held up as models of virtue, in the disapproval that greeted anyone who departed too far from what had always been done. It was enforced not by law but by reputation, by the particular social pressure of a culture that genuinely believed the eyes of the ancestors were watching, and that to fall short of their standard was to diminish not only yourself but your family, your name, your place in the long chain of Roman history. And reputation in Rome was not an abstract concern. It had a specific form, a specific name, a specific institutional expression. The censors, 2 senior magistrates elected every 5 years, were responsible for conducting the census, yes, but also for something more personal and more powerful. They assessed the moral character of Roman citizens. They could remove a senator from the rolls for conduct unbecoming. They could mark a citizen with a nota censoria, a formal notation of moral failing, that would follow him through his public life and affect his standing in ways both formal and informal. They were, in effect, the official guardians of Roman reputation, the keepers of the mos maiorum made institutional. But for all its reverence for tradition, Rome was also, and this is one of its most interesting contradictions, a society of extraordinary social mobility. Not universal mobility, not unconstrained mobility, not mobility that erased the very real disadvantages of birth and class and legal status, but more mobility than almost any other ancient society, and more than many that came after it. A freed slave could become a Roman citizen. The child of that freed slave was born fully free, with no legal stigma attached to their parentage. Talented individuals from the provinces, from Spain, from North Africa, from the Eastern Mediterranean, could rise through the military or administrative ranks to positions of enormous power. Several of Rome's greatest emperors were not Italian by birth. Trajan and Hadrian were both from Spain. Septimius Severus, who ruled from 193 to 211 AD, was from what is now Libya, the first African-born emperor of Rome, a man who rose through the military ranks with a combination of tactical brilliance and political ruthlessness to seize the throne and hold it for nearly 2 decades. He never entirely lost his North African accent, according to ancient sources, even after years in Rome. His sister, who visited him from Africa later in his reign, apparently had an accent so thick that he was deeply embarrassed by it in public. The most powerful man in the world, embarrassed by his provincial origins, even as those origins were inseparable from the qualities that had made him powerful. The Roman military that Septimius Severus had risen through was one of the most formidable fighting forces in human history, and one of the most carefully organized. A Roman legion at full strength consisted of around 5,000 heavy infantry soldiers, the legionaries, supported by cavalry units and auxiliary forces drawn from provincial populations. But the legion was far more than a fighting unit. It was an engineering corps, a construction team, a logistical operation, and a self-contained community, all at once. Legionaries built the roads they marched on. They dug the camps they slept in. They constructed the siege engines that brought down enemy walls. When not on campaign, they built the forts and walls and bridges and public buildings that marked Rome's presence in a new province. The skills required of a Roman soldier went far beyond fighting. A legionary was expected to be competent with a shovel and a pickaxe, to understand basic construction principles, to be able to read orders and keep accounts. The Roman army was the primary vehicle through which Roman engineering and Roman literacy spread across the empire, carried by ordinary soldiers who knew how to do things that the peoples they encountered often did not. The training that produced such soldiers was grueling and continuous. A Roman legionary in training marched 30 kilometers a day carrying a load of around 40 kilograms, armor, weapons, tools, rations, personal equipment. They practiced sword drills against wooden posts, the same movements repeated thousands of times until they were automatic. They swam rivers and built bridges and scaled walls and practiced formations until the formations could be executed without orders, each soldier knowing by instinct where to be and what to do when the man next to him fell. And Roman soldiers served for 25 years. A quarter-century of continuous service, after which they received a discharge bonus, either a plot of land in a Roman colony or a substantial payment in silver, that was intended to set them up for the rest of their lives. These veterans, settled in colonies across the empire, became nodes of Romanization in the provinces they retired to. People who spoke Latin, who understood Roman law and custom, who had children and grandchildren who grew up thinking of themselves as Roman regardless of what their grandparents had been before the legions came. In the long centuries of the empire's existence, this process of military service and veteran settlement, and the gradual absorption of provincial populations into Roman identity, transformed the empire from a city-state that had conquered its neighbors into something genuinely new. a civilization rather than simply a state. A shared identity that crossed ethnic and linguistic lines and held together across distances that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. What did it mean to be Roman? Not, in the end, to be born in Rome or to speak Latin as a first language or to worship Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. It meant to live within a certain set of laws, to participate in a certain set of institutions, to share a certain set of cultural reference points. The games, the baths, the forum, the toga worn on formal occasions, the particular weight of the mos maiorum pressing on every decision. The Emperor Caracalla, in 212 AD, extended Roman citizenship to virtually every free person in the empire, an act of extraordinary scope that made Romans, legally, of millions of people who had been subjects before. A Gaul and a Syrian and a Briton and an Egyptian could all, from that moment, call themselves Roman citizens and mean it in exactly the same legal sense. That act of inclusion was also, historians note, partly motivated by a very Roman practicality. Citizens paid inheritance taxes. Non-citizens did not. By making everyone a citizen, Caracalla significantly expanded the tax base. Rome's idealism and Rome's pragmatism were, as always, thoroughly intertwined, each one serving the other in ways that made it difficult to separate the noble impulse from the calculating one. The taxes collected from that expanded citizenship flowed back to Rome, and through Rome outward again, funding the army, the roads, the grain dole, the public buildings, the administrative machinery of empire. Money moving in great circular currents through the body of the civilization, the way blood moves through a living thing, sustaining everything it touched. But even the most robust circulation can falter. Even the healthiest body has its limits. By the 3rd century AD, those limits were beginning to show. The empire that had seemed, for so long, permanent, as fixed and eternal as the hills Rome was built on, was entering a period of crisis that would shake it to its foundations. Military pressure on the borders was increasing, from the Germanic tribes in the north and the resurgent Persian Empire in the east. The currency was being debased, less silver in each coin, more bronze, the purchasing power of money quietly eroding as emperors struggled to fund their armies. Political instability was accelerating, the parade of short-lived emperors made and unmade by their armies becoming faster and more chaotic. In the 50 years between 235 and 284 AD, Rome had more than 20 emperors. Almost all of them died violently. And yet, it did not collapse. Not then. Not for another 2 centuries in the west, and not for 1,000 years in the east, where the eastern half of the empire, centered on Constantinople, the city Constantine built on the shores of the Bosphorus, continued as what we call the Byzantine Empire, speaking Greek, calling itself Roman, maintaining the traditions and the legal system and much of the administrative structure of the original empire, until the Ottoman Turks finally took Constantinople in 1453 AD. 1453. 61 years before Columbus reached the Americas. The Roman Empire, in its eastern form, was still alive when medieval Europe was building its cathedrals, when Dante was writing the Divine Comedy, when the Black Death was moving across the continent. It was still there, a thread of genuine institutional continuity running back to Augustus and beyond him to the Republic, all the way back to those shepherds on their hilltops above the Tiber, until the very end of the medieval period. 1,000 years. Let that settle over you like a blanket in the dark. An empire that began as a collection of huts on a riverside hill, that grew across centuries into the most powerful civilization the Western world had ever seen, that then contracted and reformed and persisted and adapted and kept going for 1,000 years beyond what most people think of as its end. Still calling itself Roman. Still using Roman law. Still, in some meaningful sense, Rome. The eastern sky, if you could see it now from the rooftops of the city, would be just barely beginning to lighten. The thinnest suggestion of color at the horizon. Not dawn yet. Not quite. But the promise of it. Rome has been here through 10,000 of those dawns, and it will be here for 10,000 more. Rest now, in the last of the dark. The city is watching over you. The dawn is coming. You can feel it before you can see it. A quality in the air, a slight easing of the darkness, as if the night has made its peace with what comes next and is beginning, slowly and without drama, to let go. The birds know it first. Somewhere in the gardens of the Palatine, in the figs and laurels and rosemary that grow along the old walls, something small and invisible begins to sing. Just one voice at first, and then another, and then the city itself begins to stir, the way it has always stirred, the way it will always stir, on the 10,000th morning as on the first. But before the light comes fully, before Rome opens its eyes to another day, there is still a little time. A little space in the retreating dark for the last of what this city has to tell you. Because Rome's story does not end with armies or emperors or the crash of civilizations. It ends, as all the best stories do, with the small and the human and the quietly astonishing. With the details that fall through the cracks of grand history and land, somehow, still perfectly intact on the other side of 2,000 years. The things that make you realize that the people who lived in the city were not so different from the people who live in cities today, that they worried about the same things, wanted the same things, found joy and meaning in the same small corners of their daily lives. Those people left traces. Not always in monuments or laws or military victories. Sometimes in much smaller things. On the walls of Pompeii, that city frozen in a single terrible morning in 79 AD when Vesuvius buried it under meters of volcanic ash and preserved it, with heartbreaking completeness, for the archaeologists of the future, there are messages. Thousands of them, scratched or painted onto the plaster walls of buildings by ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. Election notices supporting local candidates. Advertisements for upcoming gladiatorial games. Announcements from tavern owners about what was on offer that evening. And among them, tucked between the official and the commercial, the purely personal. Someone bragging about an athletic achievement. Someone complaining about a neighbor. Someone declaring love for another person in terms that are clumsy and sincere and immediately recognizable across 2 millennia. One reads, simply, "I was here." The graffiti of Pompeii is one of the most extraordinary collections of human voices from the ancient world. Not the voices of emperors or philosophers or generals, but the voices of ordinary people, bakers and gladiators and innkeepers and schoolchildren and lovers, speaking directly across the centuries in their own unmediated words. One message found on a tavern wall complains about the quality of the wine. Another records the outcome of a dice game. One, written in a more careful hand than the others, quotes a line from Virgil, suggesting that whoever wrote it had some education, some familiarity with the literature of their civilization, and chose to mark their presence on a tavern wall with a line of poetry rather than a crude remark. Virgil himself was one of the towering figures of Roman literary culture. The Aeneid, his great epic poem, written during the reign of Augustus and telling the story of Aeneas, the Trojan hero who escapes the fall of Troy and eventually reaches Italy to found the line that will produce Romulus and ultimately Rome itself, was not simply a piece of literature. It was a political and cultural document of the first order, a story that connected Rome to the deepest roots of Greek civilization and wrapped the violence and ambition of Roman history in the language of divine destiny. It was read in schools for centuries. It was memorized. It was quoted on tavern walls by people who had absorbed it so completely that its lines came to them the way song lyrics come to us. Automatically, unbidden, the words of someone else become somehow your own. The Romans loved their poets. Loved them in the way that cultures love the people who give them their most beautiful version of themselves. Ovid, whose Metamorphoses collected the myths of the Greek and Roman world into a single continuous poem of extraordinary beauty and wit, was so popular that he was read continuously from his own lifetime through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance without interruption, one of the very few threads of genuine literary continuity running unbroken from ancient Rome to the modern world. Horace, whose odes celebrated the pleasures of wine and friendship and the Italian countryside with a warmth and precision that still translates across languages and centuries. Catullus, who wrote about love and jealousy and loss with a rawness and directness that feels less like ancient poetry and more like something written last week by someone in the grip of a feeling they cannot quite name. These were not marginal figures. They were central to Roman life, their words part of the shared cultural vocabulary of the civilization, the way certain songs or films become part of the shared vocabulary of a modern culture. To be educated in Rome was to carry these poets inside you, to have their lines available the way you have the words of songs available, rising to the surface of consciousness at the moments when nothing else quite fits. And Rome read. More than most people realize, Rome was a genuinely literate society. Not universally, literacy rates varied enormously by class and region and gender, but sufficiently that reading and writing were everyday activities for a significant portion of the population. Books existed, not bound books as we know them, but scrolls of papyrus, stored in cylindrical cases, kept on shelves in the libraries that wealthy Romans maintained in their homes as marks of status and genuine intellectual engagement alike. Public libraries existed too, established by emperors and wealthy benefactors, open to any reader who wanted access to texts they could not afford to own. The production of books in Rome was a genuine industry. Wealthy publishers employed teams of educated slaves to copy texts simultaneously, one person reading aloud while many others wrote, producing multiple copies of a work in a single session. A popular work could be reproduced in quantity and distributed to bookshops across the empire. Cicero wrote to friends in distant cities and mentioned finding his own works for sale in their local shops, the ancient equivalent of finding your book on a shelf in a foreign country, an experience that has presumably always produced the same small complicated mixture of pride and strangeness. All of that writing, all of those scrolls, all of those carefully copied texts, much of it is gone. Lost in fires and floods and deliberate destruction and the simple entropy of centuries. Scholars estimate that we have recovered perhaps 10% of the literature produced in the ancient world. 10%. The other 90% has vanished, leaving only occasional traces, a title mentioned in a surviving text, a fragment quoted in someone else's work, a few lines preserved in a medieval manuscript where a monk found a passage worth recording before the original deteriorated beyond saving. What remains is extraordinary. What is gone is unimaginable. Entire plays by Sophocles. Histories by writers whose names we know but whose works we cannot read. Scientific treatises. Philosophical dialogues. Poetry. Love letters. The inner lives of people who thought carefully and felt deeply and put those thoughts and feelings into words that survived for centuries before finally, somewhere in the long unraveling of the ancient world, being lost. Rome read and wrote and argued and built and ate and bathed and loved and grieved. And it also, in the quieter corners of its daily life, played. Romans played board games with a seriousness and enthusiasm that would be entirely recognizable today. A game called Ludus Latruncularum, the game of mercenaries, was a strategy game played on a grid board with pieces of two different colors, the object being to capture your opponent's pieces by surrounding them. It was the Roman equivalent of chess, played in Thermopolia and private homes and army camps across the empire. The kind of game that could absorb an afternoon or an entire evening, that caused arguments and grudges and the particular satisfaction of a well-executed trap. Game boards have been found scratched into the steps of the forum, into the floors of bathhouses, into the pavements outside temples. Anywhere people might sit and wait and have 20 minutes to fill and a willing opponent nearby. Children played with toys that are immediately recognizable. Dolls made of wood or bone or terracotta, with jointed limbs that could be posed. Miniature carts and animals. Spinning tops. Hoops rolled with a stick through the streets. A Roman child playing with a jointed doll in the courtyard of an insulae 2,000 years ago was doing something that a child today would recognize immediately and without explanation, across every barrier of language and time and culture. The Romans also kept pets. Dogs especially. The Romans loved dogs with a warmth and specificity that is entirely familiar. Different breeds were recognized and prized for different qualities. Hunting dogs, guard dogs, small companion dogs kept purely for affection. The mosaic warning sign found at the entrance of a Pompeian house, Cave Canem, beware of the dog, is one of the most recognizable phrases from the ancient world, and it was not merely decorative. It was a genuine household notice, the ancient equivalent of the warning signs people put on their gates today. The dog it warned about is long gone. The warning remains. Romans also kept songbirds, fish in elaborate garden pools, and, among the very wealthy, exotic animals brought from the farthest reaches of the empire. A senator might have a pool of prized eels that he had trained to come to his hand to be fed, and would mourn their deaths with a sincerity that his Roman peers found either touching or absurd depending on their temperament. The elder Pliny records a Roman gentleman who wept at the death of his favorite eel with what Pliny clearly considered excessive grief, but the fact that Pliny records it at all suggests it was not so unusual as to be beyond imagination. The Romans ate together, played together, grieved together. And they also worried together, about health, about the body, about the invisible forces that seemed to govern whether a person lived or died, recovered or declined. Roman medicine was a fascinating mixture of genuine empirical observation and elaborate superstition, and it is sometimes difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. The physician Galen, who practiced in Rome in the 2nd century AD, and became the most influential medical writer in the history of Western medicine, made genuine and important contributions to the understanding of anatomy and physiology. He understood that arteries carried blood rather than air, which had been a point of confusion for earlier physicians. He developed theories about the function of the spinal cord that were largely correct. He performed dissections on animals, since human dissection was prohibited, and drew careful conclusions from what he observed. His writings dominated European medical thought for over 1,000 years, well into the Renaissance, a reign of intellectual influence almost unparalleled in the history of science. And yet Galen also believed in the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, as the fundamental substances governing human health, and recommended treatments that ranged from the sensible to the alarming. Medicine at the frontier of knowledge always looks like this, in any age. The genuinely insightful and the deeply mistaken sitting side by side, impossible to fully separate until the future arrives with better instruments. Romans who could not afford Galen, which was most of them, turned to a mixture of folk remedies, temple medicine, and the practical knowledge of household members who had accumulated experience with illness across generations. The temple of Asclepius, the god of healing, on the Tiber Island in Rome, was a place where the sick came to sleep overnight in the hope of receiving a healing dream, a divine diagnosis delivered in sleep, which the temple priests would then interpret and translate into a course of treatment. It sounds, from a modern perspective, like pure superstition. But the treatments prescribed were often genuinely helpful. Rest, clean water, specific foods, time away from the pressures of daily life. The god, working through his priests, was sometimes prescribing what we would now call evidence-based supportive care. The framework was theological. The outcomes were occasionally medical. The Tiber Island itself is one of the strangest and most quietly remarkable places in Rome. A small island in the middle of the river, shaped, or at least said by Romans to be shaped, like a ship, with a stone prow built at its downstream end to complete the illusion. It had been associated with healing since the 3rd century BC, when a plague struck Rome and a delegation was sent to the Greek city of Epidaurus to bring back the sacred serpent of Asclepius. The serpent, according to the story, slipped off the ship as it came up the Tiber and swam to the island, and was understood to have chosen it as his home. A temple was built. The healing tradition began, and the island has been associated with medicine ever since. Today, it houses a hospital, as it has in various forms for much of the past 2,000 years. The same small island in the same river, still caring for the sick, still fulfilling the purpose the sacred serpent chose for it on the day it swam ashore. Dawn is closer now. The sky to the east has shifted from black to the deepest blue, and at the very horizon there is the first suggestion of a color that is not quite purple and not quite gold, but somewhere between the two, the color that has no name except early morning. The city is beginning to remember itself, and in the remembering, something important surfaces. Something that runs beneath all the marble and the law and the engineering and the poetry like the deepest current in a river. The thing that made Rome not just powerful but meaningful. Not just large but worthy of the long memory that has preserved it. Rome believed in something. Not perfectly, not consistently, not without enormous hypocrisy and contradiction, and the violence that attends all empires without exception. But genuinely, underneath all of that, Rome believed in the possibility of civilization itself. In the idea that human beings, organized and governed and educated and given access to clean water and a fair legal system and something beautiful to look at and something meaningful to participate in, could live better than they would otherwise live. Could be more than they would otherwise be. That belief, imperfect, compromised, self-serving as it often was, is the thing that made Rome worth remembering. Not the conquest, not the spectacle, not even the extraordinary engineering, but the underlying conviction that a city, a society, a civilization, was worth building and worth maintaining and worth handing forward to the people who would come after, so that they could build on it and add to it and pass it on in turn. The Romans had a phrase for the ideal of public service, residential publica, the public thing, the thing that belongs to everyone and therefore to no one exclusively, the thing that must be tended and maintained by each generation on behalf of the next. It is where we get our word republic, and the ideal it expressed, that a society is a shared project, that its institutions and infrastructure and culture belong to all of its members and carry obligations as well as benefits, is one of the most powerful political ideas in human history. Imperfectly realized in Rome, as it has been imperfectly realized everywhere it has ever been attempted. But alive. Alive in Rome in a way it had not been quite alive before, and alive in the world still, carried forward through the centuries in the laws and the institutions and the political vocabulary that Rome bequeathed to every civilization that came after it. In its final centuries, Rome contracted. The western half of the empire, the old heartland, Italy and Gaul and Britain and Spain, fragmented under the pressure of external migrations and internal weakness, the administrative machinery that had held it together becoming too expensive and too complicated to maintain. The last Western emperor, a young man named Romulus Augustulus, a name that carried, with painful irony, both the name of Rome's legendary founder and the name of its first emperor, was deposed in 476 AD by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer, who simply sent him into comfortable exile in a castle in southern Italy rather than killing him, as if even the act of ending the Western Roman Empire could not quite be brought to do it violently. The boy was pensioned off. The empire ended not with a battle, but with a letter of resignation sent to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. And life went on. The people who had been Roman subjects woke up the next morning in the same houses, walked the same roads, used the same laws, spoke variants of the same language. The institutions persisted even as the political structure that had produced them faded. The church filled the administrative vacuum. The roads kept being traveled. The aqueducts, where they were maintained, kept running. What Rome left behind was not ruins, or not only ruins. It left a template, a set of working solutions to the problems of organizing large numbers of human beings into something coherent and functional, and occasionally even beautiful. Solutions that proved so robust and so well designed that every civilization that encountered them, the medieval kingdoms of Europe, the Islamic caliphates, the Byzantine Empire, the Renaissance city-states, the early modern monarchies, and eventually the democratic republics of the modern world, took what Rome had built and adapted it and used it and built on it and passed it on. We live, still, inside a Rome-shaped world. The shape of our laws, the layout of our cities, the structure of our calendars, the vocabulary of our politics and our architecture and our languages. The very alphabet you are reading these words in traces its ancestry back through Latin to the Roman script that spread across the empire on inscriptions and documents and coins and the painted walls of buildings from Britain to Mesopotamia. You are reading Roman letters, thinking in a language shaped by Latin, living under laws descended from Roman jurisprudence, measuring your year by a calendar Julius Caesar reformed, driving on roads whose routes sometimes still follow the lines that Roman engineers surveyed 2,000 years ago. Rome is not the past. Rome is the substrate, the layer everything else is built on, so deep and so thoroughly incorporated that we no longer notice it, any more than we notice the bones inside our own bodies. It is simply the shape of things, the way the world is. And at the very center of all of it, the origin point, the place where the first shepherd drew the first line in the dirt and said, "This is where the city begins," Rome itself still stands. Not as a ruin, as a city, a living, breathing, argued over, traffic jammed, pizza eating, politically complicated, magnificently beautiful city of 3 million people, built on and around, and sometimes literally inside the bones of its ancient self. The Colosseum stands in the middle of the city the way a great old tree stands in the middle of a forest. Everything else has grown up around it, and the city has organized itself in relation to it without ever quite deciding what to do about it. Medieval houses were built inside its arches. Renaissance palaces quarried its stone. Modern roads circle it like a moat. The Pantheon is still in use. Not as a temple, though it was a temple for centuries after the Empire, but as a church, the Basilica of Santa Maria ad Martires, with the tombs of Italian kings and the painter Raphael inside its walls, and the same oculus open to the same sky that it has been open to for 1900 years. On certain days, at certain times, the column of light still falls through that opening and moves across the floor in its slow daily arc, indifferent to everything that has changed around it. The Forum is ruins now, largely, the temples reduced to columns and foundations and the occasional standing wall. But in the early morning, before the tourists arrive, in the particular quality of light that Rome has in the hour after dawn, a golden, slightly hazy, ancient-feeling light that seems to come from inside the stone as much as from the sky, the Forum can feel startlingly alive. As if the emptiness is temporary. As if the voices are just around the corner, just out of hearing, just about to resolve into something intelligible if you could only get a little closer and listen a little harder. The fountains are still running. In Rome today there are more than 2,000 fountains, more than in any other city in the world. Many of them fed, still, by ancient aqueduct routes that were restored and rebuilt during the Renaissance and have been running continuously ever since. The Trevi Fountain, the most famous in the world, is fed by an aqueduct called the Aqua Virgo, the Virgin Water, which was built by Agrippa, the great general and engineer of Augustus's reign, in 19 BC. The same water source, more or less, that has been delivering water to the center of Rome for more than 2,000 years, arriving now in a cascade of Baroque sculpture and the sound of water falling into stone, the same sound the ancient fountains made, the same sound that ran beneath everything in Rome's long night, steady and continuous and alive. Visitors throw coins into the Trevi Fountain to ensure their return to Rome. Millions of coins, every year, thrown over the left shoulder with the right hand, landing in the water with small bright sounds. The tradition is modern, from a 1954 film, but the impulse is ancient. The Roman impulse to make an offering, to complete a transaction with the world beyond the visible, to give something in order to receive something, to mark a moment and a place with the small ceremony of a coin dropped in water. Do you da? I give so that you might give. Rome is still teaching us how to be human. The light is fully here now. Gold and warm and unhurried, falling across the rooftops and the old walls and the gardens where the birds have been singing for an hour already, filling the air with something that has no name but feels, unmistakably, like beginning. Rome has had this morning 10,000 times, 100,000 times. It will have it again tomorrow, and the day after, and for as long as there are people here to notice the light changing, and the birds singing, and the water running in the fountains, and the old stones warming slowly in the new day's sun. And you have spent the night here, walking through it. listening, letting it wash over you the way the light washes over the Forum in the early morning, slowly and completely, touching everything it finds. You know things now that you did not know when you closed your eyes. Not the heavy, effortful knowledge of study and examination, but the lighter kind, the kind that arrives through story, through the side door of attention, settling gently into the places in your mind where it will simply live from now on, surfacing occasionally in odd moments, making the world feel slightly larger and more various and more interesting than it did before. You know that the world was once organized around a city on 7 hills. That 1,000,000 people found ways to live together in its narrow streets, to feed themselves and clean themselves and argue and love and grieve and find pleasure and meaning and the particular satisfaction of a life lived at the center of something enormous and alive. That they built things meant to last, and that those things did last, longer than anyone had a right to expect. That they made mistakes on a grand scale and achieved things on a grander one. That they were, underneath all of it, people, specific, particular, irreducible people, who wanted what most people have always wanted. To be fed, to be clean, to be heard, to be remembered, to have been here. The fountains are running. The light is on the hills. Rome is awake. And so, gently and completely, are you. Sleep well. The morning had arrived, but Rome was not finished with you yet. Because a city this old, this layered, this endlessly various, a city that had been building itself and rebuilding itself for the better part of 3,000 years, could not possibly be contained in a single night's walk. There were always more streets around the next corner. Always more doors behind which something surprising was happening, or had once happened, or would happen again. Always more Rome, no matter how much Rome you had already seen. So let the morning hold for a moment. Let the light stay gentle and the air stay cool and the birds continue their conversation in the garden walls. There is more to tell, more to carry with you into the day that is coming, more to set down quietly in the places in your mind where things are kept for the long term, for the slow accumulation of a life well and curiously lived. We have walked through the grand spaces of Rome, the Forum, the Colosseum, the Palatine, the Pantheon. We have visited the baths and the bakeries and the theaters and the temples. But there is a Rome that exists beneath all of those spaces, beneath the streets themselves, beneath the foundations of the buildings and the roots of the trees in the old gardens. A Rome that went underground not by accident but by design, carved into the soft volcanic rock beneath the city by people who needed space that the crowded surface could not provide. The catacombs. Most people associate the Roman catacombs with Christians, and the Christian catacombs are indeed the most famous and the most extensively visited. But the practice of underground burial in Rome predates Christianity by centuries, and was not exclusive to any single religious community. Jewish communities had their own catacombs beneath the city. Pagan Romans used underground burial chambers. The catacombs were not a Christian invention but a Roman one, adapted by the Christian community during the period when burial within the city walls was legally prohibited and land for above-ground cemeteries was expensive and scarce. The Christian catacombs of Rome extend for somewhere between 170 and 190 kilometers of underground tunnels beneath the city. 170 kilometers. Carved by hand through the tufa rock, stacked in galleries sometimes 5 or 6 levels deep, lined on either side with the rectangular niches, called loculi, where the dead were laid and sealed behind thin slabs of marble or terracotta. 6 million people may be buried in the catacombs beneath Rome. 6 million. The dead beneath the city outnumber the living above it many times over, and they have been there, in the dark and the silence and the cool of the rock, through every century of the city's long history above them. The catacombs were not, as they are sometimes imagined, dark and terrifying places in the minds of the people who used them. They were sacred spaces, places of community and memory, and the particular comfort that comes from knowing that the dead are nearby, are tended, are not forgotten. Early Christian communities held memorial meals in the catacombs on the anniversaries of the deaths of their members, gathering underground around the graves of those they had lost, sharing food and prayers in the lamplight, maintaining the connection between the living and the dead that every human culture has found ways to honor. The walls of the catacombs are covered in paintings. Frescoes executed in the flickering light of oil lamps by artists working in confined spaces, painting images of fish and doves and the breaking of bread, images from the Hebrew scriptures and the new Christian stories, images of the deceased portrayed in the idealizing style of Roman portraiture, dignified, composed, dressed in the respectable clothing of a Roman citizen regardless of their actual social standing in life. In death, the catacombs made everyone a full Roman, everyone worthy of being remembered in paint on stone. Above the catacombs, on the surface of the city, life continued with the particular Roman combination of the practical and the magnificent. And nowhere was that combination more visible than in the Roman approach to death at the other end of the social spectrum, the deaths of emperors, which were occasions of extraordinary theatrical elaboration. When an emperor died, a good emperor, one who had served Rome well and whose memory the Senate wished to honor, the Senate could vote to grant him a particular distinction. Apotheosis, deification, the formal declaration that the emperor had, upon death, joined the gods, that he was no longer simply a man who had ruled, but a divine being worthy of worship, to be added to the long list of Roman deities with temples and priests and festivals in his honor. The ceremony of apotheosis was one of the most spectacular rituals in all of Roman public life. The emperor's body, or in some cases a wax effigy, if the body was not available, was placed on an elaborate multi-tiered funeral pyre in the Campus Martius. The pyre was constructed like a building, several stories high, each tier smaller than the one below, decorated with ivory and gold and purple cloth and garlands and the spoils of the emperor's victories. At the very top, an eagle was placed in a cage. The pyre was lit, and as it burned, as the flames reached the upper tiers, the cage was opened and the eagle was released, ascending into the sky above Rome in the sight of the assembled crowd, carrying the emperor's soul upward with it into the company of the gods. The eagle ascending, the crowd watching in silence as it rose above the smoke and the heat and the noise of the city, growing smaller and smaller against the blue sky until it disappeared entirely. Whether anyone in that crowd truly believed they were watching an emperor become a god is impossible to say with certainty across 2,000 years of distance. But the moment was real. The smoke was real. The bird was real. And the feeling that something significant had just happened, that a life of consequence had ended and been marked in a way worthy of its consequence, that was real too, regardless of what theology lay behind it. Rome understood ceremony, understood that human beings need rituals to mark the passages of their lives, births and deaths and the transitions between one state and another, and that those rituals, performed with sufficient care and beauty, could do something that purely practical action could not. could make the invisible visible, could give shape to feelings that would otherwise have nowhere to go. It is one of the things Rome got right, in a way that still resonates. The understanding that beauty and meaning are not luxuries but necessities, that a civilization which fails to provide them will find its people seeking them elsewhere, in ways that may be less orderly and less constructive. The games, the temples, the baths, the public art, the ceremonies, all of it was, in some sense, Rome's answer to the human need for something more than food and shelter. The need for significance, for the sense that life, lived within a particular community and a particular set of shared meanings, amounts to something worth the effort of living it. The morning light has fully arrived now, falling warm and golden across the old stones, and Rome is properly awake, the streets beginning to fill, the first voices drifting up from below. But the city holds its night memories quietly within itself, as it always does, as it always has. The morning Rome and the nighttime Rome coexist in the same streets, the same buildings, the same worn stones that have absorbed so many years of human presence that they seem sometimes almost to breathe. There was a practice in Rome, particularly in the wealthier households, in the great senatorial families whose ancestry stretched back through the centuries of the Republic, of keeping the faces of the dead present in the house of the living. When a distinguished Roman died, a wax mask was made of their face and stored in a wooden cabinet in the atrium of the family home. These masks, the imagens maiorum, the images of the ancestors, were brought out on important occasions. At funerals, actors wearing the masks of the family's distinguished dead would walk in the funeral procession, dressed in the official clothing appropriate to the highest office each ancestor had held, so that the procession became a gathering not just of the living mourners but of the illustrious dead, all the generations of the family walking together one more time through the streets of Rome. Imagine that procession. The living and the masked dead moving through the city together, all the faces of a family's history present simultaneously in the morning light. A senator of the Republic, walking beside a consul of 50 years ago, walking beside a general of a century before. The past made physically present, given costumes and masks and the dignity of public appearance, refusing to stay buried. That is Rome's relationship with its history made visible. The conviction that the past is not gone but available, present, capable of being called up and made to walk among the living whenever the living need reminding of where they come from. The Romans were, in so many ways, a people defined by their relationship with time. With the past they carried forward, and the future they built toward. They planted trees whose shade they knew they would never sit in, built aqueducts that would serve generations they would never meet, wrote laws intended to govern situations they could not anticipate, laid roads across landscapes they would never personally travel. They thought in centuries, planned in centuries, built in centuries. And the things they built in centuries have lasted millennia. That is the final, and perhaps the deepest lesson of Rome. Not any specific fact about its laws or its engineering or its military organization, but the underlying orientation, the decision to take the long view, to build as if what you build will outlast you because it might. To govern as if the decisions you make today will echo forward into a future you cannot see, because they will. To treat the civilization you inhabit not as something you found and are using up, but as something you are responsible for maintaining and improving and handing on, in better condition than you found it, to the people who will come after you and who will, in turn, do the same. Rome did not always live up to that ideal. No civilization does. But it held the ideal. kept it alive through centuries of failure and compromise and the ordinary human difficulty of doing the right thing when the easier thing is so immediately available. And the ideal itself, residential publica, the public thing, the shared project of civilization, survived Rome and entered the bloodstream of every culture that came after it, where it has been circulating ever since. The light is fully gold now. The city is fully awake. The carts that were banned from the streets during the day have long since returned to their stables, and the people have taken the streets back, filling them with the noise and energy and color of a Roman morning in full flower. Somewhere in the city, a child is running. A dog is barking at something it has decided, without much evidence, to be suspicious of. A baker is sliding the last of the morning's loaves out of the oven. A water carrier is filling a jug at the nearest lacus, the fountain's overflow running cool and clear across the stone and down into the channel below. An old man is sitting on a step in the sun with his eyes closed, his face tilted upward, doing nothing except existing in the warmth, which is, on a morning like this, more than enough. Rome goes on, as it always has, as it always will, and you have been here for all of it. There is one more thing the morning has to offer before we let Rome go. One more turn through the streets. One more look at the things the city made and the people who made them and the ideas that outlasted them both. The light is warm and the air is still cool, and there is that particular quality to the world in the early morning. A freshness, a sense of possibility, that Rome has always known how to use. The Romans were, among everything else they were, morning people. People who understood that the early hours had a clarity to them that the rest of the day would gradually obscure, and who filled those hours with the things that mattered most. Business and education, and the particular kind of thinking that requires quiet, and the absence of the afternoon's accumulated noise. So here, in the last of the morning's clarity, are the things we have not yet told you. The things that have been waiting, patient and unhurried, for exactly this moment. Rome was a city of remarkable women, even in a legal system that did not always acknowledge them as such. The law of the Republic gave Roman women very limited formal power. They could not vote, could not hold public office, could not serve in the military or practice law in the formal sense. And yet the reality of Roman women's lives, particularly in the imperial period, was considerably more complex and considerably more interesting than those legal limitations suggest. Wealthy Roman women managed households of enormous complexity, estates that functioned like small businesses, with staff and accounts and supply chains and the constant logistical demands of maintaining a large Roman family at a high social standard. They educated their children, supervised their children's education, maintained the social networks that were the lifeblood of Roman political life, and exercised through those networks a kind of informal influence that was entirely real even when it was legally invisible. The phrase behind every great man, whatever its limitations as a general truth, describes something that Roman sources acknowledged openly: the influence of mothers and wives and sisters on the men who nominally held the power. Some Roman women went considerably further than informal influence. Livia, the wife of Augustus, was by most ancient accounts one of the most politically astute people of her generation, managing the complex dynamics of the imperial succession across decades with a patience and skill that her husband openly relied on. She was deified after her death, made a goddess, given a priesthood, worshipped across the empire. Fulvia, the wife of Mark Antony, actually commanded armies during the civil wars of the late Republic, one of the very few women in Roman history to exercise direct military command. And Agrippina the Younger, mother of Nero, was described by the historian Tacitus as effectively co-ruling the empire during the early years of her son's reign, conducting diplomacy, managing appointments, and exercising an authority so visible and so substantial that it made the Senate profoundly uncomfortable. The discomfort of the Senate with powerful women was itself revealing. It meant the power was real. You do not feel threatened by something that has no actual force. The anxiety that runs through Roman male writing about strong women, the warnings, the disapproval, the elaborate rhetorical frameworks constructed to explain why female power was dangerous and unnatural, is the anxiety of people who can feel the ground shifting under their feet, who know, whatever they say publicly, that the categories they are defending are less stable than they would like them to be. Rome was always, underneath its official surfaces, more complicated than its official surfaces suggested, more various, more contested, more alive with the friction of different people pushing against the limits of the roles they had been assigned and finding, more often than the written record fully acknowledges, ways to exceed them. That friction, between what Rome officially was and what Rome actually was in the lived experience of its millions of inhabitants, is part of what makes it so endlessly interesting to study. Because Rome is not a simple story. It is not a triumphant march of progress, nor a simple tale of oppression and decline. It is a human story, which means it is contradictory and surprising and full of moments that resist the neat categories we might prefer to impose on it. Full of people behaving unexpectedly. Full of ideas arriving before their time and institutions lasting past their usefulness and individuals doing things that the system they lived in said were impossible. In the last decades of the Western Empire, as the political and military structures were contracting and fragmenting, something unexpected happened to the Latin language. Instead of dying with the empire that had spread it, it transformed. It broke apart into dialects, shaped by the different regions where it had taken root, influenced by the languages of the Germanic peoples who were settling across the former imperial territories, evolving according to the particular pressures and histories of each place. And from those dialects emerged, over the following centuries, the Romance languages: Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, French, Romanian, Catalan, each one a living descendant of Latin, carrying within its vocabulary and its grammar and its rhythms the deep memory of the language that Roman soldiers and merchants and administrators had carried to every corner of the Western world. More than 900 million people speak a Romance language as their first language today. 900 million people whose mother tongue is, in the most literal linguistic sense, a form of Latin, who are speaking, when they say madre or mare or may, a word that any Roman citizen would have immediately recognized, whose sentences are built on a grammatical architecture that would be familiar, in its deep structure, to a schoolchild doing Latin exercises in Rome 2,000 years ago. The language died and became 900 million living voices. That is not loss. That is transformation so successful it looks, from a sufficient distance, almost like a kind of immortality. With the language went the law, and with the law went the administrative habits, and with the administrative habits went something subtler and harder to name, a way of thinking about organization, about the relationship between the individual and the collective, about the obligations that come with citizenship and the protections that should accompany them. The Roman way of thinking about these things entered the bloodstream of European civilization so early and so completely that it became indistinguishable from the civilization itself. The fish does not notice the water. The medieval church conducted its affairs in Latin, kept its records in Latin, debated its theology in Latin. And through the church, Latin remained the common intellectual language of European civilization for more than 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Empire, connecting scholars and theologians and scientists across languages and borders, allowing a monk in Ireland and a philosopher in Italy and a scientist in Germany to read each other's work and build on each other's ideas without needing a translator. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, the work of Copernicus and Galileo and Newton and the others who remade the human understanding of the physical world, was conducted largely in Latin. Newton's Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, was written in Latin. More than 1,200 years after the last Western emperor sent his letter of resignation to Constantinople, the language of Rome was still the language in which the most important ideas of the age were being expressed. The Romans left us one more gift that is so woven into the fabric of daily life that almost no one ever thinks to attribute it to Rome: the 7-day week. The Romans did not invent the 7-day week. It came originally from Babylonian astronomical tradition, transmitted through Jewish and then wider Mediterranean culture. But it was Rome that spread it across the Western world and gave each day the name of a celestial body in a sequence that has survived, with minor modifications, into every modern European language. Sun's day, Moon's day, Mars's day, Mercury's day, Jupiter's day, Venus's day, Saturn's day. In English, the Germanic names replaced some of the Roman ones. Tuesday is Tiw's day, Wednesday is Woden's day, Thursday is Thor's day, Friday is Frigg's day. But the structure is Roman, and in the Romance languages the Roman names are still fully visible. Lunes, Martes, Miércoles, Jueves, Viernes. Monday, Mars Day, Mercury Day, Jupiter Day, Venus Day. The planets of the ancient world, named for the gods of Rome, still organizing human time every week without interruption. Saturday is still Saturn's day. Sunday is still the sun's day. The Roman sky is still above us, structuring our weeks, telling us what day it is, connecting us, whether we know it or not, to the people who first looked up at those same planets and decided that their movements through the heavens were important enough to name the days after. The morning is well established now. The sun has cleared the hills entirely, and the light has shifted from the soft gold of dawn to the brighter, more decisive light of mid-morning, the kind of light that makes shadows sharp and colors vivid and the world look, briefly, like a place where things are possible. Rome always looked like that in the morning. Still does. Because there is something about a city that has survived everything Rome has survived: fire and plague and civil war and the fall of empires and the rise of new ones and the slow patient erosion of 27 centuries, that gives it a particular quality of permanence. Not the permanence of something that has never been tested, but the permanence of something that has been tested repeatedly and is still here. That quality is visible in the stones, in the way the old buildings sit in the landscape, not heavily, not defiantly, but with the quiet assurance of things that have simply outlasted every reason they should not exist. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius, whom we visited earlier in the long night, writing by lamplight in his campaign tent, wrote in his meditations about the impermanence of all things, about how the great figures of the past, the powerful and the famous and the celebrated, had all passed away and been forgotten, their names surviving at best as sounds in the mouths of people who did not fully understand what those names had meant. He was writing this from inside the most powerful empire in the world, at the height of his own power, and he was telling himself, reminding himself, in the patient way he had, that none of it would last. That impermanence was the fundamental condition of all things, and that the wise person accepted this rather than fighting it. He was right, of course. And also, in a way he could not have anticipated, he was wrong. Because his own name has survived. His own words have survived. The private words he never meant for anyone else to read. Written to himself in the dark of a military camp on the edge of the empire he did not want. Those words are still here, still read, still quoted, still capable of moving people who encounter them for the first time and finding, with something like shock, that a man who has been dead for 1900 years is describing their own experience of being alive with more precision than they could have managed themselves. That survival, the survival of words, of ideas, of the particular quality of thought that certain individuals manage to achieve and commit to writing, is perhaps the deepest form of Roman immortality. More durable than the concrete. More lasting than the roads. Because the roads can be dug up, and the concrete can be demolished, and the laws can be rewritten. But an idea that has found the right words and been copied and recopied across the centuries becomes, eventually, something close to indestructible. Cicero knew this. In one of his letters, the vast collection of personal correspondence that has survived, giving us an astonishingly intimate window into the life and mind of one of Rome's greatest figures, he wrote about the desire to be remembered. To have done something that would outlast the brief span of a human life. Not out of vanity, he insisted, though he was vain enough to acknowledge it cheerfully, but out of the deeper human need to have mattered, to have been part of something larger than oneself, to have contributed something, however small, to the long project of civilization that would still be underway long after the individual contributor was gone. He has been remembered. More than 2,000 years of being remembered. His letters, his speeches, his philosophical works still read, still studied, still quoted in law courts and philosophy departments, and the private reading of people who find in him, despite everything, despite the distance of millennia and the vast differences of world and custom, someone surprisingly, uncomfortably familiar. The desire to be remembered. We have come back to it, here at the end, as perhaps we always knew we would, because it is the most human of all desires and the one that Rome, more than almost any other civilization in history, managed to satisfy. Not for its emperors and generals alone, but for the ordinary people too. For the baker whose oven is still warm in the archaeological record. For the person whose handprint is still visible in the concrete of an ancient wall. For the child whose jointed doll was found in the ruins of a house buried by a volcano. For everyone who scratched their name into a stone, or painted their face in a catacomb fresco, or dropped a coin in a fountain, and made a wish. They wanted to have been here. They were here. And something of their having been here is still here, in the stones and the paint and the words and the water running through the old channels, still finding its way downhill through the city the way it always has, the way gravity intended, the way the Roman engineers planned. Rome gave us concrete and law and language and roads. It gave us the calendar and the alphabet and the 7-day week. It gave us the concept of the public good and the presumption of innocence and the idea that a city should provide its people with clean water and beautiful spaces and something worth watching on a Tuesday afternoon. It gave us poets whose words still move, and architects whose solutions still work, and engineers whose harbor walls are still hardening in the sea. But perhaps the most remarkable thing Rome gave us is something that cannot be easily catalogued or measured or pointed to in a museum. It is the proof of concept, the demonstration, conducted across 8 centuries of Roman history and 1,000 years of Byzantine continuation, that human civilization, for all its violence and injustice and stupidity and cruelty, is capable of achieving something genuinely extraordinary. Something that builds and endures and spreads and transforms and survives and keeps going, in one form or another, longer than anyone had any right to expect. The proof that it is worth trying. The sun is well up now. The Forum is filling with visitors, has been filling with visitors, in one form or another, for 2,500 years, people coming from near and far to stand in the space where so much happened, to feel the weight of it, to try to close the distance between themselves and the people who were here before them. They cannot close it. Nobody can. The distance is real, and it is final, and the people who walked these stones are gone beyond any reaching. But they left enough behind, in the stones and the words and the laws and the languages and the water still running in the fountains, that the attempt to close the distance is not futile, is not foolish, is, in fact, one of the most worthwhile things a person can do with an hour or a lifetime. To stand in a place where history happened and try to feel what it felt like to be alive there. To read the words of people long dead and find in them something that connects to your own experience of being alive. To understand that you are part of a chain, that you received something from the people who came before you and that you will pass something forward to the people who come after, whether you intend to or not, whether you are aware of it or not, whether your name is remembered or lost entirely to time. You are part of the chain. You always were. Rome fell, as all things fall. The Western Empire in 476 AD, the Eastern in 1453. But in between those two dates and beyond them on both sides, Rome had already accomplished something that falling could not undo. It had happened. It had been real. It had shaped the world so thoroughly and so deeply that the world could not be unshapen by its absence. The thing about civilizations that truly matter is that they do not simply occupy their moment in time and then vacate it. They change the conditions under which all subsequent moments occur. Rome changed the conditions. Changed the roads, literally, changed where the roads went, and the roads determined where the towns grew up, and the towns determined where the cities are today. Changed the laws, and the laws determined what was considered just, and what is considered just shapes every legal argument being made at this very moment in courtrooms across the Western world. Changed the language, and the language changed thought, and changed thought is the most permanent change of all because it does not require any physical substrate to persist. It lives in minds, and minds make new minds, and the thought keeps going. The fountain in the corner of the old courtyard is still running. It has been running, in one form or another, since before anyone now alive was born, since before their grandparents were born, since before memory reaches in any direction a living person can access. The water comes from the hills, follows the slope, finds the channel, arrives at the basin, spills over the lip, runs down the stone, and begins the journey again. The same water, more or less. The same hills. The same gravity. The same patient, continuous, utterly reliable fact of water finding its way downhill through whatever landscape it is given. Rome is like that, finding its way downhill through history, following the slope of human need and human organization, and the deep grooves cut by centuries of accumulated practice, arriving, always, somewhere recognizable. somewhere that carries the memory of the source even when the source itself is out of sight. And now, truly, it is time to rest. You have walked the length of Rome in the night and the early morning. You have stood in the Forum and the Colosseum and the Pantheon and the catacombs and the garden of a wealthy senator's house and the counter of a thermopolium and the steps where someone scratched a game board into the stone 1,000 years before anyone now living drew their first breath. You have heard the water and smelled the bread and felt the warmth of the bathhouse and the cool of the underground tunnels and the particular quality of Roman morning light on old stone. You have been, for a little while, inside the longest story the Western world knows how to tell. And the longest story the Western world knows how to tell ends, as all the best stories end, not with a conclusion but with a continuation. With the sense that it is still going, that it has not finished, that around the next corner of history, in the next century or the next millennium, something else will emerge from what Rome left behind, something we cannot yet name or imagine, built on foundations we inherited without knowing it, shaped by ideas that were old when the Pantheon was new. Rome is not behind us. Rome is underneath us. And underneath is exactly where a foundation belongs. Sleep well. The fountains are running. They always are.